The Open Society and Its Enemies _ Volume 2, Karl R. Popper. Volume 2 of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. The High Tide of Prophecy carries the critique of historicism from Aristotle and Hegel's new tribalism through Marx's method, prophecy, and ethic to oracular irrationalism and the question whether history has meaning. This summary reconstructs chapters 11 to 25 in Popper's Critical Rationalist Register. Abstract. Volume 2 of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, The High Tide of Prophecy, chapters 11 to 25, carries the critique of historicism from Aristotle's essentialist roots and Hegel's new tribalism through Marx's sociological determinism, economic historicism, class analysis, and legal political theory to the evaluation of his prophecy, historicist morality, Mannheim's sociology of knowledge, the revolt against reason, and the question whether history has meaning. Popper reconstructs Marx's anti-psychologism and institutional successes while refuting historical prophecy, defends critical rationalism, piecemeal engineering, and democratic control of power against oracular philosophy, moral futurism, and sociologism. It concludes that history has no inherent meaning, but ends we may impose by fighting for the open society. Executive summary. Central thesis. Historicism reaches its high tide in Hegel and Marx. Essences unfold in history, social science becomes prophecy, and politics is pronounced impotent before economic destiny. Popper argues that this program fails methodologically and politically. Where Marx illuminates institutions, class situation, surplus population, formal versus material freedom, unintended social repercussions, he succeeds by situational logic, not inexorable laws. His prophecies of increasing misery, proletarian revolution, and classless socialism are invalid and refuted by experience. The historicist legacy breeds moral futurism, sociology of knowledge sociologism, and oracular irrationalism, all of which undermine the public criticism and democratic institutions on which the open society depends. History has no meaning in the historicist sense. We impose ends by rational, piecemeal, institutional reform tested in practice. Foundational observations. Aristotelian roots, essentialism, teleological optimism, and definition worship prepare historicism and oracular philosophy. Knowing essences through history leads to history as court of justice. Hegel and new tribalism, dialectics immunize dogma, state spirit, war, might as right, Prussian patronage, racial and Marxist heirs share historicist framework. Marx's sociological determinism, anti-psychologism and autonomy of sociology, conspiracy theory rejected, social existence determines consciousness without reducing institutions to human nature. Economic historicism and classes, kingdom of necessity versus freedom. Economism as suggestive background, not metaphysical essence. Objective class interest and social net. All history is class struggle overstated. Legal system and paradox of freedom. State as superstructure and political impotence critiqued. Formal freedom insufficient. Democratic politics can control economic power. Institutional versus personal intervention. Prophecy evaluated. Three-step argument fails. Misery refuted. Solidarity not guaranteed. New class likely. Interventionism is third alternative to capitalism and Marxian socialism. Social democrats and communists unprepared by prophecy. Moral theory of historicism. Implicit ethic of capital. Institutional injustice. Activism, historicist morality and moral futurism. Sociologism and ethics cannot shift responsibility to the future. Sociology of knowledge, Mannheim's total ideologies and sociotherapy. Objectivity as public method, piecemeal engineering versus consciousness raising. Oracular philosophy and revolt against reason. Critical versus comprehensive rationalism. Irrational emphasis on emotion leads to crime. Whitehead and Toynbee as eminent oracular retreat. Beware false prophets of tribal return. History without meaning. Searchlight theory. Selectivity without relativism. History of power, not of mankind. Conscience versus success. ends imposed by us, hope without certainty. Significance and recommendation. Volume 2 is the indispensable sequel for anyone who read Popper's Plato critique in Volume I and needs the modern historicist line, Aristotle to Hegel to Marx to 20th century irrationalism, dissected in the same forensic register. Read chapters 13 to 17 for Marx's method and the paradox of freedom, 18 to 21 for prophecy and its political consequences, 22 to 23 for historicist ethics and Mannheim, 24 to 25 for the rationalism, irrationalism, conflict, and history's meaning. Pair with the poverty of historicism for the methodological case in compact form. Do not treat Popper's hostility to Hegel and Marx as excuse to ignore their institutional insights. His point is precisely that those insights survive when prophecy is discarded. For democratic social reform, the operative legacy is piecemeal engineering, institutional taming of power, and critical rationalism, not historical fortune-telling. Chapter 11. The Aristotelian Roots of Hegelianism. The task of writing a history of the ideas in which we are interested, of historicism and its connection with totalitarianism, will not be attempted here. The reader will remember, I hope, that I do not even try to give more than a few scattered remarks which may throw light on the background of the modern version of these ideas. I shall therefore not attempt a serious treatment of Aristotle, except in so far as his version of Plato's essentialism has influenced the historicism of Hegel, and thereby that of Marx. The restriction to those ideas of Aristotle with which we have become acquainted in our criticism of Plato does not, however, create as serious a loss as one might fear at first sight. For Aristotle, in spite of his stupendous learning and his astonishing scope, was not a man of striking originality of thought. What he added to the Platonic store of ideas was, in the main, systematization and a burning interest in empirical and especially in biological problems. Aristotle is Plato's systematizer. In some of Plato's latest writings, we can find an echo of the contemporary political developments in Athens, of the consolidation of democracy. It seems that even Plato began to doubt whether some form of democracy had not come to stay. In Aristotle, we find indications that he did not doubt any longer. Although he is no friend of democracy, he accepts it as unavoidable and is ready to compromise with the enemy. An inclination to compromise, strangely mixed with an inclination to find fault with his predecessors and contemporaries, and with Plato in particular, is one of the outstanding characteristics of Aristotle's encyclopedic writings. They show no trace of the tragic and stirring conflict that is the motive of Plato's work. Instead of Plato's flashes of penetrating insight, we find dry systematization and the love, shared by so many mediocre writers of later times, for settling any question whatever by issuing a sound and balanced judgment that does justice to everybody, which means at times by elaborately and solemnly missing the point. This exasperating tendency, which is systematized in Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean, is one of the sources of his so often forced and even fatuous criticism of Plato. Doctrine of the mean, Aristotle's habit of issuing balanced judgments that do justice to everybody, which means at times elaborately and solemnly missing the point. An example of Aristotle's lack of historical insight is the fact that he acquiesced in the apparent democratic consolidation just when it had been superseded by the imperial monarchy of Macedon. Aristotle sat down to dinner with monarchy without becoming aware of it, is Gomper's appropriate comment. Aristotle's thought is entirely dominated by Plato's. Somewhat grudgingly, he followed his great teacher as closely as his temperament permitted, not only in his general political outlook, but practically everywhere. So he endorsed and systematized Plato's naturalistic theory of slavery. Some men are by nature free and others slaves. And for the latter, slavery is fitting as well as just. A man who is by nature not his own, but another's, is by nature a slave. Hellenes do not like to call themselves slaves, but confine this term to barbarians. The slave is totally devoid of any faculty of reasoning, while free women have just a very little of it. By arguing against the fighters for freedom, he preserved some of their utterances. the best state, and feudal caste. But the theory of slavery is only one of Plato's many political ideas to be adopted by Aristotle. Especially his theory of the best state, as far as we know it, is modeled upon the theories of the Republic and the laws, and his version throws considerable light on Plato's. Aristotle's best state is a compromise between three things: a romantic Platonic aristocracy, a sound and balanced feudalism, and some democratic ideas. But feudalism has the best of it. With the Democrats, Aristotle holds that all citizens should have the right to participate in the government. But this, of course, is not meant to be as radical as it sounds, for Aristotle explains at once that not only slaves, but all members of the producing classes are excluded from citizenship. Thus, he teaches with Plato that the working classes must not rule, and the ruling classes must not work, nor earn any money. They own the land, but must not work it themselves. Only hunting, war, and similar hobbies are considered worthy of the feudal rulers. Aristotle's fear of any form of money-earning goes perhaps even further than Plato's. Plato had used the term banausic to describe a plebeian, abject, or depraved state of mind. Aristotle extends the disparaging use of the term so as to cover all interests which are not pure hobbies. For Aristotle, every form of professionalism means a loss of caste. Liberal education. Aristotle's idea of a gentleman's education, as opposed to the education of a slave, serf, servant, or professional man. The first principle of all action is leisure. It is indeed strange to see that one of the greatest scholars of all time does not wish to be a professional scholar. He would rather be a dilettante and a man of the world. With Aristotle, Platonic philosophy gives up her great aspirations, her claims to power. From this moment, it could continue only as a teaching profession. And since hardly anybody but a feudal lord had the money and the leisure for studying philosophy, all that philosophy could aspire to was to become an annex to the traditional education of a gentleman. Philosophical speculation and contemplation may become a most important part of his good life. The best way of spending one's leisure since, as Aristotle himself puts it, nobody would arrange a war for that purpose. Optimism, teleology, and essentialism. It is plausible to assume that such a courtier's philosophy will tend to be optimistic. And indeed, in its optimism lies the one important adjustment made by Aristotle in his systematization of Platonism. Plato's sense of drift had expressed itself in his theory that all change, at least in certain cosmic periods, must be for the worse. All change is degeneration. Aristotle's theory admits of changes which are improvements. Thus change may be progress. This peculiar optimistic twist was an outcome of biological speculation also. It was based upon the idea of a final cause. According to Aristotle, one of the four causes of anything, also of any movement or change, is the final cause, or the end towards which the movement aims. Insofar as it is an aim or a desired end, the final cause is also good. The form or essence of anything developing is identical with the purpose or end or final state towards which it develops. This characterizes Aristotle's substitution of optimism for pessimism. Aristotle's teleology is an expression of his predominantly biological interests. It is influenced by Plato's biological theories, and also by Plato's extension of his theory of justice to the universe. Plato tried to explain the weight of heavy bodies by the assumption that they strive to retain or to regain the place inhabited by their kind. Aristotle developed it as his famous theory of natural places. Everything, if removed from its own natural place, has a natural tendency to return to it. Despite some alterations, Aristotle's version of Plato's essentialism shows only unimportant differences. Aristotle insists that, unlike Plato, he does not conceive the forms or ideas as existing apart from sensible things. But as a biologist, he assumes that sensible things carry potentially within themselves the seeds, as it were, of their final states or of their essences. For Aristotle, all movement or change means the realization or actualization of some of the potentialities inherent in the essence of a thing. Nature, he writes in Metaphysics, belongs also to the same class as potentiality, for it is a principle of movement inherent in the thing itself. Quote, only if a person or a state develops, and only by way of its history, can we get to know anything about its hidden, undeveloped essence, to use a phrase of Hegel's. This doctrine leads later, first of all, to the adoption of an historicist method, and further to the worship of history and its exaltation as the grand theater of reality, as well as the world's court of justice. Historicist seeds in Aristotle. Aristotle, who was a historian of the more encyclopedic type, made no direct contribution to historicism. But it may be shown here how his theory of change lends itself to historicist interpretations, and that it contains all the elements needed for elaborating a grandiose historicist philosophy, an opportunity not fully exploited before Hegel. Three historicist doctrines which directly follow from Aristotle's essentialism may be distinguished. First, only through history can we know the hidden essence of a person or state. Second, change reveals what was hidden in the undeveloped essence, leading to the historicist idea of an historical fate. Third, in order to become real or actual, the essence must unfold itself in change, which, with Hegel, becomes a new justification of the theory of slavery, for self-assertion means, insofar as one's relations to others are concerned, the attempt to dominate them. All these far-reaching historicist consequences were slumbering for more than 20 centuries, hidden and undeveloped, in Aristotle's essentialism. Aristotelianism was more fertile and promising than most of its many admirers know. 2. Essentialist definitions in modern science. We have reached a point from which we could, without delay, proceed to an analysis of the historicist philosophy of Hegel. As a kind of digression, however, I shall next discuss a more technical problem, Aristotle's essentialist method of definitions. The problem of definitions and of the meaning of terms does not directly bear upon historicism, but it has been an inexhaustible source of confusion and of that particular kind of verbiage which, when combined with historicism in Hegel's mind, has bred that poisonous intellectual disease of our own time, which I call oracular philosophy. And it is the most important source of Aristotle's regrettably still prevailing intellectual influence, of all that verbal and empty scholasticism that haunts not only the Middle Ages, but our own contemporary philosophy. Oracular philosophy, the intellectual disease bred when Aristotelian essentialism combines with historicism. Verbal scholasticism that haunts not only the Middle Ages, but contemporary philosophy, including, as we shall see, strands of Wittgenstein. Knowledge, basic premises, and intellectual intuition. Aristotle followed Plato in distinguishing between knowledge and opinion. Knowledge, or science, according to Aristotle, may be of two kinds, either demonstrative or intuitive. Demonstrative knowledge consists of statements that can be demonstrated, the conclusions, together with their syllogistic demonstrations. Intuitive knowledge consists in grasping the indivisible form or essence or essential nature of a thing. It is the originative source of all science, since it grasps the original basic premises of all demonstrations. Undoubtedly, Aristotle was right when he insisted that we must not attempt to prove or demonstrate all our knowledge. Every proof must proceed from premises. The proof as such can therefore never finally settle the truth of any conclusion, but only show that the conclusion must be true provided the premises are true. It was in order to avoid such an infinite regress that Aristotle taught that we must assume that there are premises which are indubitably true and which do not need any proof, and these he called basic premises. But how to obtain these basic premises? Like Plato, Aristotle believed that we obtain all knowledge ultimately by an intuitive grasp of the essences of things. We can know a thing only by knowing its essence, Aristotle writes, and to know a thing is to know its essence. A basic premise is, according to him, nothing but a statement describing the essence of a thing. But such a statement is just what he calls a definition. Thus, all basic premises of proofs are definitions. What does a definition look like? An example of a definition would be, a puppy is a young dog. Aristotle considers the term to be defined as a name of the essence of a thing, and the defining formula as the description of that essence. And he insists that the defining formula must give an exhaustive description of the essence or the essential properties of the thing in question. Thus, a statement like a puppy has 4 legs, although true, is not a satisfactory definition, since it does not exhaust what may be called the essence of puppiness. Eventually, Aristotle simply postulates that we possess an intellectual intuition, a mental or intellectual faculty which enables us unerringly to grasp the essences of things and to know them. Summing up this brief analysis, we can give, I believe, a fair description of the Aristotelian ideal of perfect and complete knowledge if we say that he saw the ultimate aim of all inquiry in the compilation of an encyclopedia containing the intuitive definitions of all essences, that is to say, their names together with their defining formulae. Science versus essentialism. Now, there can be little doubt that all these essentialist views stand in the strongest possible contrast to the methods of modern science. First, although in science we do our best to find the truth, we are conscious of the fact that we can never be sure whether we have got it. We have learned in the past, from many disappointments, that we must not expect finality, and we have learned not to be disappointed any longer if our scientific theories are overthrown. For we can, in most cases, determine with great confidence which of any 2 theories is the better one. We can therefore know that we are making progress. And it is this knowledge that to most of us atones for the loss of the illusion of finality and certainty. In other words, we know that our scientific theories must always remain hypotheses, but that, in many important cases, we can find out whether or not a new hypothesis is superior to an old one. For if they are different, then they will lead to different predictions, which can often be tested experimentally. Thus, we can say that in our search for truth, we have replaced scientific certainty by scientific progress. Science does not develop by a gradual encyclopedic accumulation of essential information, as Aristotle thought, but by a much more revolutionary method. It progresses by bold ideas, by the advancement of new and very strange theories, and by the overthrow of the old ones. In science, there is no knowledge, in the sense in which Plato and Aristotle understood the word, in the sense which implies finality. What we usually call scientific knowledge is, as a rule, not knowledge in this sense, but rather information regarding the various competing hypotheses and the way in which they have stood up to various tests. Quote, "Insofar as scientific statements refer to the world of experience, they must be refutable. And insofar as they are irrefutable, they do not refer to the world of experience." Nominalist definitions. While we may say that the essentialist interpretation reads a definition normally, that is to say from the left to the right, we can say that a definition, as it is normally used in modern science, must be read back to front or from the right to the left, for it starts with the defining formula and asks for a short label to it. Thus, the scientific view of the definition, "a puppy is a young dog," would be that it is an answer to the question, what shall we call a young dog, rather than an answer to the question, what is a puppy? The scientific use of definitions, characterized by the approach from the right to the left, may be called its nominalist interpretation, as opposed to its Aristotelian or essentialist interpretation. In modern science, only nominalist definitions occur. That is to say, shorthand symbols or labels are introduced in order to cut a long story short. Definitions do not play any very important part in science. 4 shorthand symbols can always, of course, be replaced by the longer expressions, the defining formula, for which they stand. Our scientific knowledge, in the sense in which this term may be properly used, remains entirely unaffected if we eliminate all definitions. The only effect is upon our language, which would lose, not precision, but merely brevity. There could hardly be a greater contrast than that between this view of the part played by definitions and Aristotle's view. For Aristotle's essentialist definitions are the principles from which all our knowledge is derived. They thus contain all our knowledge. As opposed to this, the scientific or nominalist definitions do not contain any knowledge whatever, not even any opinion. They do nothing but introduce new arbitrary shorthand labels. Criticism of intellectual intuition and define your terms. Aristotle held with Plato that we possess a faculty, intellectual intuition, by which we can visualize essences and find out which definition is the correct one. My opinion is that we can readily admit that we possess something which may be described as intellectual intuition, or more precisely, that certain of our intellectual experiences may be thus described. Everybody who understands an idea or a point of view, in the sense that he has got the feel of it, might be said to understand that thing intuitively. But I would insist, on the other hand, that these experiences can never serve to establish the truth of any idea or theory, however strongly somebody may feel, intuitively, that it must be true or that it is self-evident. Such intuitions cannot even serve as an argument, for somebody else may have just as strong an intuition that the same theory is false. The way of science is paved with discarded theories which were once declared self-evident. Francis Bacon sneered at those who denied the self-evident truth that the sun and the stars rotated round the earth, which was obviously at rest. Science does not ask how he has got his ideas. It is only interested in arguments that can be tested by everybody. The great mathematician, Gauss, described this situation very neatly once when he exclaimed, "I have got my result, but I do not know yet how to get it." The second doctrine to be criticized has even more important connections with modern views. Since Aristotle, it has become widely known that one cannot prove all statements, and that an attempt to do so would break down because it would lead only to an infinite regression of proofs. But neither he nor, apparently, a great many modern writers seem to realize that the analogous attempt to define the meaning of all our terms must, in the same way, lead to an infinite regression of definitions. Quote, "If we do not know precisely the meanings of the words we use, we cannot discuss anything profitably. Most of the futile arguments on which we all waste time are largely due to the fact that we each have our own vague meanings for the words we use and assume that our opponents are using them in the same senses. If we defined our terms to start with, we could have far more profitable discussions." This passage is very characteristic of one of the prejudices which we owe to Aristotle. Let us consider whether this can really be done. First, we can see clearly that if politicians, or anybody else, were compelled by law to define any term they wished to use, their speeches would not be shorter, but infinitely long. For a definition cannot establish the meaning of a term any more than a logical derivation can establish the truth of a statement. From this point of view, we may criticize a doctrine like that of Wittgenstein, who holds that while science investigates matters of fact, it is the business of philosophy to clarify the meaning of terms, thereby purging our language and eliminating linguistic puzzles. Any preoccupation with meaning tends to lead to that result which is so typical of Aristotelianism, scholasticism, and mysticism. Let us consider briefly how these two typical results of Aristotelianism have arisen. Aristotle insisted that demonstration or proof and definition are the two fundamental methods of obtaining knowledge. Considering the doctrine of proof first, it cannot be denied that it has led to countless attempts to prove more than can be proved. Medieval philosophy is full of this scholasticism. With the Romantics, a new kind of dogmatism becomes fashionable in philosophy as well as in the social sciences. It confronts us with its dictum, and we can take it or leave it. A similar result was produced by Aristotle's doctrine of definition. First, it led to a good deal of hair-splitting. But later, philosophers began to feel that one cannot argue about definitions. In this way, essentialism not only encouraged verbalism, but it also led to the disillusionment with argument, that is, with reason. Scholasticism and mysticism and despair in reason. These are the unavoidable results of the essentialism of Plato and Aristotle. And Plato's open revolt against freedom becomes, with Aristotle, a secret revolt against reason. As we know from Aristotle himself, essentialism and the theory of definition met with strong opposition when they were first proposed, especially from Socrates' old companion Antisthenes, whose criticism seems to have been most sensible. But this opposition was unfortunately defeated. The consequences of this defeat for the intellectual development of mankind can hardly be overrated. 3. From Aristotle to Christianity and the Open Society. It will hardly be necessary again to stress the fact that my treatment of Aristotle is most sketchy, much more so than my treatment of Plato. The main purpose of what has been said about both of them is to show the role they have played in the rise of historicism and in the fight against the Open Society, and to show their influence on problems of our own time. On the rise of the oracular philosophy of Hegel, the father of modern historicism and totalitarianism. The conflict between the Platonic Aristotelian speculation and the spirit of the great generation of Pericles, of Socrates, and of Democritus can be traced throughout the ages. This spirit was preserved, more or less purely, in the movement of the Cynics who, like the early Christians, preached the brotherhood of man, which they connected with a monotheistic belief in the fatherhood of God. It is very likely that these ideas, and perhaps the Cynic movement itself, influenced the rise of Christianity also. Early Christianity and the revolt against tribalism. In its beginning, Christianity, like the Cynic movement, was opposed to the highbrow, Platonizing idealism and intellectualism of the scribes, the learned men. I do not doubt that it was, in part, a protest against Jewish tribalism, against its rigid and empty tribal taboos, and against its tribal exclusiveness which expressed itself in the doctrine of the chosen people. Such an emphasis upon tribal laws and tribal unity appears to be characteristic not so much of a primitive tribal society as of a desperate attempt to restore and arrest the old forms of tribal life. But side by side with this movement towards greater rigidity, we find another movement which produced humanitarian ideas that resembled the response of the great generation to the dissolution of Greek tribalism. This process repeated itself when Jewish independence was ultimately destroyed by Rome. It led to a new and deeper schism between the return of the tribe, as represented by Orthodox Jewry, and the humanitarianism of the new sect of Christians, which embraced barbarians as well as slaves. It can hardly be doubted that this development was, like that of Plato's ideas, inspired by a strong antagonism to the new creed of the Open Society, in this case, of Christianity. But the parallelism between the creed of the great generation, especially of Socrates, and that of early Christianity goes deeper. There is little doubt that the strength of the early Christians lay in their moral courage. They refused to accept Rome's claim that it was entitled to compel its subjects to act against their conscience. The Christian martyrs who rejected the claims of might to set the standards of right suffered for the same cause for which Socrates had died: the Church, the Inquisition, and medieval Romanticism. It is clear that these matters changed very considerably when the Christian faith itself became powerful in the Roman Empire. The question arises whether official recognition of the Christian Church was not an ingenious political move on the part of the ruling powers, designed to break the tremendous moral influence of an equalitarian religion. In other words, the question arises whether Rome did not find it necessary to apply Pareto's advice, to take advantage of sentiments, not wasting one's energies in futile efforts to destroy them. This question cannot be dismissed by appealing to our historical sense that warns us against attributing motives that are anachronistically cynical. For such motives are openly expressed as early as in the 5th century BC by Critias, the leader of the 30 tyrants. With Justinian's persecution of non-Christians, heretics, and philosophers, AD 529, the Dark Ages began. The Church followed in the wake of Platonic Aristotelian totalitarianism, a development that culminated in the Inquisition. The theory of the Inquisition, more especially, can be described as purely Platonic. It is set out in the last 3 books of the Laws, where Plato shows that it is the duty of the shepherd rulers to protect their sheep at all costs by preserving the rigidity of the laws and especially of religious practice and theory, even if they have to kill the wolf. It is one of the characteristic reactions to the strain of civilization in our own time that the allegedly Christian authoritarianism of the Middle Ages has, in certain intellectualist circles, become one of the latest fashions of the day. Men believe God to rule the world. This belief limited their responsibility. The new belief that they had to rule it themselves created for many a well-nigh intolerable burden of responsibility. All this has to be admitted. But I do not doubt that the Middle Ages were, even from the point of view of Christianity, not better ruled than our Western democracies. Quote, to this he replied by telling the parable of the priest and the Levite who both, seeing a wounded man in great distress, passed by on the other side, while the Samaritan bound up his wounds and looked after his material needs. As a moving comment upon the suffering of the people in those days, a passage may be quoted from H. Zinzer's book, Rats, Lice, and History, in which he speaks about epidemics of dancing mania in the Middle Ages. These strange seizures seem, rather, like mass hysterias brought on by terror and despair, in populations oppressed, famished, and wretched to a degree almost unimaginable today. Zinzer sums up his characterization of the people who lived in those days of authoritarianism as a terror-stricken and wretched population, which had broken down under the stress of almost incredible hardship and danger. Is it necessary to ask which attitude is more Christian, one that longs to return to the unbroken harmony and unity of the Middle Ages, or one that wishes to use reason in order to free mankind from pestilence and oppression? But some part at least of the authoritarian church of the Middle Ages has succeeded in branding such practical humanitarianism as worldly, as characteristic of Epicureanism, and of men who desire only to fill their bellies like the beasts. The terms Epicureanism, materialism, and empiricism, that is to say, the philosophy of Democritus, one of the greatest of the great generation, became in this way the synonyms of wickedness, and the tribal idealism of Plato and Aristotle was exalted as a kind of Christianity before Christ. Indeed, this is the source of the immense authority of Plato and Aristotle, even in our own day, that their philosophy was adopted by medieval authoritarianism. But it must not be forgotten that, outside the totalitarian camp, their fame has outlived their practical influence upon our lives. And although the name of Democritus is seldom remembered, his science, as well as his morals, still live with us. Quote, the chief danger to our philosophy, apart from laziness and woolliness, is scholasticism, which is treating what is vague as if it were precise. Chapter 12. Hegel and the New Tribalism. Popper opens his assault on Hegel with a warning that is itself a piece of forensic theater. I believe the reader should be discouraged in advance from taking Hegel's bombastic and mystifying cant too seriously. And Popper proceeds to justify that counsel by showing that the most influential systematic philosopher of 19th century Germany was, at once, a master logician of a peculiar sort and a purveyor of what Schopenhauer called charlatanry. Hegel, Popper insists, was the source of all contemporary historicism, a direct follower of Heraclitus, Plato, and Aristotle who achieved the most miraculous things. His powerful dialectical methods drew real physical rabbits out of purely metaphysical silk hats. Starting from Plato's Timaeus and its number mysticism, Hegel succeeded in proving by purely philosophical methods, 114 years after Newton's Principia, that the planets must move according to Kepler's laws. He even accomplished the deduction of the actual position of the planets, thereby proving that no planet could be situated between Mars and Jupiter. Unfortunately, it had escaped his notice that such a planet had been discovered a few months earlier. Similarly, he proved that magnetizing iron means increasing its weight, that Newton's theories of inertia and of gravity contradict each other, and many other things of this kind. Historicism, the doctrine that history reveals essences, destinies, and rational necessity in the development of institutions and nations. Dialectics, Hegel's method of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which Popper treats as a device for immunizing dogma against criticism. Quote, the philosophy of Hegel, then, was a scrutiny of thought so profound that it was for the most part unintelligible. Hegel's rise, magic, dishonesty, and Prussian patronage. That such a surprisingly powerful philosophical method was taken seriously can be only partially explained by the backwardness of German natural science in those days. For the truth is, I think, that was not at first taken really seriously by serious men, such as Schopenhauer or J.F. Fries, not at any rate by those scientists who, like Democritus, would rather find a single causal law than be the king of Persia. Hegel's fame was made by those who prefer a quick initiation into the deeper secrets of this world to the laborious technicalities of a science, which, after all, may only disappoint them by its lack of power to unveil all mysteries. They soon found out that nothing could be applied with such ease to any problem whatsoever, and at the same time with such impressive though only apparent difficulty, and with such quick and sure but imposing success as Hegelian dialectics, the mystery method that replaced barren formal logic. Hegel's success was the beginning of the age of dishonesty, as Schopenhauer described the period of German idealism, and of the age of irresponsibility, as K. Heyden characterizes the age of modern totalitarianism, first of intellectual, and later, as one of its consequences, of moral irresponsibility, of a new age controlled by the magic of high-sounding words and by the power of jargon. In spite of all this, it seems improbable that Hegel would ever have become the most influential figure in German philosophy without the authority of the Prussian state behind him. As it happened, he became the first official philosopher of Prussianism, appointed in the period of feudal restoration after the Napoleonic Wars. Later, the state also backed his pupils. Germany had, and still has, only state-controlled universities, and they in their turn backed one another, having thus become a tremendous success on the continent. Hegelianism could hardly fail to obtain support in Britain from those who, feeling that such a powerful movement must, after all, have something to offer, began to search for what Sterling called the secret of Hegel. Prussianism. Hegel's role as state-appointed philosopher during the post-Napoleonic Restoration, turning philosophy into an instrument of feudal reaction. Age of dishonesty. Schopenhauer's name for the period in which dialectical jargon replaced scientific clarity. Quote, Hegel's influence has remained a most powerful force, in spite of the fact that scientists never took him seriously. Hegel's influence, and especially that of his Kant, is still very powerful in moral and social philosophy and in the social and political sciences, with the sole exception of economics. Why Hegel still matters. But if interest in Hegel among philosophers is vanishing, why worry any more about him? Popper's answer is that Hegel's influence has remained a most powerful force in politics and the moral sciences. In politics, this is shown most drastically by the fact that the Marxist extreme left wing, as well as the conservative center and the fascist extreme right, all base their political philosophies on Hegel. The left wing replaces the war of nations which appears in Hegel's historicist scheme by the war of classes. The extreme right replaces it by the war of races, but both follow him more or less consciously. How can this immense influence be explained? Popper's main intention is not so much to explain this phenomenon as to combat it. Yet he offers a few explanatory suggestions. Philosophers have kept around themselves, even in our day, something of the atmosphere of the magician. Hegelianism fits these views admirably. It is exactly what this kind of popular superstition supposes philosophy to be. It knows all about everything. It has a ready answer to every question. Medieval authoritarianism began to dissolve with the Renaissance, but on the continent, its political counterpart, medieval feudalism, was not seriously threatened before the French Revolution. The breakdown of feudalism made the need for a new defense of authoritarianism manifest. Hegel, I believe, supplied this need. Sound, heat, and deliberate bewitchment. To discourage the reader beforehand from taking Hegel too seriously, Popper quotes Hegel on sound and heat from the philosophy of nature. Hegel writes that sound is the change in the specific condition of segregation of the material parts, and in the negation of this condition, merely an abstract or ideal ideality of that specification. But this change is itself immediately the negation of the material specific subsistence, which is real ideality of specific gravity and cohesion, i.e., heat. Popper translates, the heating up of sounding bodies is heat together with sound. The question arises whether Hegel deceived himself, hypnotized by his own inspiring jargon, or whether he boldly set out to deceive and bewitch others. Popper is satisfied that the latter was the case. especially in view of what Hegel wrote in a letter about Schelling's philosophy of nature. I have had too much to do with mathematics, differential calculus, chemistry, Hegel boasts, but this is just bluff. To let myself be taken in by the humbug of the philosophy of nature, by this philosophizing without knowledge of fact, and by the treatment of mere fancies, even imbecile fancies as ideas. This is a very fair characterization of Schelling's method, that audacious way of bluffing which Hegel himself copied, or rather aggravated, as soon as he realized that, if it reached its proper audience, it meant success. Quote, "The heating up of sounding bodies is heat together with sound." Hegelian metaphysics. Essence in flux and the state as spirit. Hegel believes, with Aristotle, that the ideas or essences are in the things in flux. Or more precisely, Hegel teaches that they are identical with the things in flux. Everything actual is an idea, he says. But this does not mean that the gulf opened up by Plato between the essence of a thing and its sensible appearance is closed. For Hegel writes that any mention of essence implies that we distinguish it from the being of the thing, and that upon the latter, as compared with essence, we rather look as mere appearance or semblance. Also like Plato and Aristotle, Hegel conceives the essences, at least those of organisms, and therefore also those of states, as souls or spirits. Unlike Plato, Hegel does not teach that the trend of the development of the world in flux is a descent away from the idea towards decay. Like Speusippus and Aristotle, Hegel teaches that the general trend is rather towards the idea. It is progress. Although he says with Plato that the perishable thing has its basis in essence and originates from it, Hegel insists, in opposition to Plato, that even the essences develop. In Hegel's world, as in Heraclitus, everything is in flux, and the essences, originally introduced by Plato in order to obtain something stable, are not exempted. But this flux is not decay. Hegel's historicism is optimistic. His essences and spirits are self-moving, self-developing, emerging, and self-creating. They propel themselves towards a self-realizing final cause. This final cause is what Hegel calls the absolute idea, or the idea. Essentialism, the doctrine that we know things by grasping their essences or spirits, not merely their appearances. Optimistic historicism. Unlike Plato's decline, Hegel's world stage advances dialectically toward perfection. The collectivist state and the stage of history. The collectivist Hegel, like Plato, visualizes the state as an organism. And following Rousseau, who had furnished it with a collective general will, Hegel furnishes it with a conscious and thinking essence, its reason or spirit. This spirit, whose very essence is activity, is at the same time the collective spirit of the nation that forms the state. To an essentialist, knowledge or understanding of the state must clearly mean knowledge of its essence or spirit. And as we have seen in the last chapter, we can know the essence and its potentialities only from its actual history. Thus we arrive at the fundamental position of historicist method. The way of obtaining knowledge of social institutions such as the state is to study its history, or the history of its spirit. The spirit of a nation determines its hidden historical destiny, and every nation that wishes to emerge into existence must assert its individuality or soul by entering the stage of history. That is to say, by fighting the other nations. The object of the fight is world domination. Hegel, like Heraclitus, believes that war is the father and king of all things, and that war is just. The history of the world is the world's court of justice, writes Hegel. The unity of opposites plays such an important part in the evolution, in the dialectical progress, that we can describe the war of opposites and their unity or identity as the main ideas of Hegel's dialectics. So far, this philosophy appears as a tolerably decent and honest historicism, and there seems to be no reason to describe it, with Schopenhauer, as charlatanism. But this appearance begins to change if we now turn to an analysis of Hegel's dialectics. Quote, "The history of the world is the world's court of justice." Dialectics, Kant's attack on metaphysics turned upside down. Hegel proffers his dialectic method with an eye to Kant, who in his attack upon metaphysics had tried to show that all speculations of this kind are untenable. Hegel never attempted to refute Kant. He bowed and twisted Kant's view into its opposite. This is how Kant's dialectics, the attack upon metaphysics, was converted into Hegelian dialectics, the main tool of metaphysics. Kant, in his critique of pure reason, asserted under the influence of Hume that pure speculation or reason, whenever it ventures into a field in which it cannot possibly be checked by experience, is liable to get involved in contradictions or antinomies, and to produce what he unambiguously described as mere fancies, nonsense, illusions, a sterile dogmatism, and a superficial pretension to the knowledge of everything. Kant's intention was to stop once and forever the accursed fertility of the scribblers on metaphysics. Unfortunately, the effect was very different. None of the metaphysical scribblers who came after Kant made any attempt to refute him, and Hegel, more particularly, even had the audacity to patronize Kant for reviving the name of dialectics, which he restored to their post of honor. He taught that Kant was quite right in pointing out the antinomies, but that he was wrong to worry about them. It just lies in the nature of reason that it must contradict itself. It is not a weakness of our human faculties, but it is the very essence of all rationality that it must work with contradictions and antinomies. Antinomy: Kant's pairing of equally provable metaphysical theses and antitheses beyond experience. Dialectic triad: thesis produces antithesis. Their conflict yields synthesis on a higher level. Hegel's three-beat rhythm of progress. Contradiction as progress, and as intellectual suicide. Hegel asserted that mankind develops, and with it our social heritage. But what we are pleased to call our own reason is nothing but the product of this social heritage, of the historical development of the social group in which we live, the nation. This development proceeds dialectically. First, a thesis is proffered, but it will produce criticism. It will be contradicted by opponents who assert its opposite, an antithesis. And in the conflict of these views, a synthesis is attained, a kind of unity of the opposites, a compromise or reconciliation on a higher level. The synthesis absorbs the two original opposite positions by superseding them. It reduces them to components of itself, thereby negating, elevating, and preserving them. Popper is quite prepared to admit that this is not a bad description of the way in which a critical discussion, and therefore also scientific thought, may sometimes progress. For all criticism consists in pointing out some contradictions or discrepancies, and scientific progress consists largely in the elimination of contradictions wherever we find them. This means, however, that science proceeds on the assumption that contradictions are impermissible and avoidable, so that the discovery of a contradiction forces the scientist to make every attempt to eliminate it. And indeed, once a contradiction is admitted, all science must collapse. But Hegel derives a very different lesson from his dialectic triad. Since contradictions are the means by which science progresses, he concludes that contradictions are not only permissible and unavoidable, but also highly desirable. This is a Hegelian doctrine which must destroy all argument and all progress. Hegel's intention is to operate freely with all contradictions. All things are contradictory in themselves, he insists, in order to defend a position which means the end not only of all science, but of all rational argument. By making argument and criticism impossible, he intends to make his own philosophy proof against all criticism, so that it may establish itself as a reinforced dogmatism, secure from every attack, and the unsurmountable summit of all philosophical development. Quote, all things are contradictory in themselves. The philosophy of identity, real is reasonable, might is right. The other pillar of Hegelianism is his so-called philosophy of identity. Popper does not intend to waste the reader's time by attempting to make sense of it, for in the main, the philosophy of identity is nothing but shameless equivocation, and, to use Hegel's own words, it consists of nothing but fancies, even imbecile fancies. The leading idea is Heraclitus' doctrine of the unity of opposites. The path that leads up and the path that leads down are identical, Heraclitus had said, and Hegel repeats this when he says, the way west and the way east are the same. But there is method in this madness, and even Prussian method. For behind the apparent confusion, there lurk the interests of the absolute monarchy of Frederick William. The philosophy of identity serves to justify the existing order. Its main upshot is an ethical and juridical positivism, the doctrine that what is good, since there can be no standards but existing standards, is the doctrine that might is right. Plato had said that the ideas alone are real, and that perishable things are unreal. Hegel adopts from this the equation ideal equals real. Kant talked about the ideas of pure reason, using idea in the sense of ideas in the mind. Hegel adopts from this the doctrine that the ideas are something mental or spiritual or rational. Idea equals reason. Combined, these two equivocations yield real equals reason, and this allows Hegel to maintain that everything that is reasonable must be real, and everything that is real must be reasonable. And since there can be no higher standard in existence than the latest development of reason and of the idea, everything that is now real or actual exists by necessity. It must be reasonable as well as good. Particularly good, as we shall see, is the actually existing Prussian state. Philosophy of identity, the fusion of opposites, subjective belief and objective truth, essence and appearance, into a single higher unity that sanctifies the status quo. Ethical positivism, the doctrine that existing institutions define the only valid moral standard. Truth as self-evidence for the up-to-date. All that is reasonable is real. This means that all that is reasonable must conform to reality, and therefore must be true. Truth develops in the same way as reason develops, and everything that appeals to reason in its latest stage of development must also be true for that stage. In other words, everything that seems certain to those whose reason is up to date must be true. Self-evidence is the same as truth. Provided you are up to date, all you need is to believe in a doctrine. This makes it by definition true. In this way, the opposition between what Hegel calls the subjective, i.e. belief, and the objective, i.e. truth, is turned into an identity. And this unity of opposites explains scientific knowledge also. The idea is the union of subjective and objective. Science presupposes that the separation between itself and truth is already canceled. Quote, the idea is the union of subjective and objective. Science presupposes that the separation between itself and truth is already canceled. Dialectical applications, perverting the ideas of 1789. Hegel's dialectics, Popper asserts, are very largely designed to pervert the ideas of 1789. Hegel was perfectly conscious of the fact that the dialectic method can be used for twisting an idea into its opposite. Dialectics, he writes, are no novelty in philosophy. Socrates used to simulate the wish for some clearer knowledge about the subject under discussion, and after putting all sorts of questions with that intention, he brought those with whom he conversed round to the opposite of what their first impression had pronounced correct. As a description of Socrates' intentions, this is perhaps not very fair, but as a statement of Hegel's own intention, it is excellent. Freedom of thought turned into state censorship. As a first example, Popper selects the problem of freedom of thought, of the independence of science, and of the standards of objective truth as treated by Hegel in the Philosophy of Law, section 270. Hegel begins with what can only be interpreted as a demand for freedom of thought and for its protection by the state. The state, he writes, has thought as its essential principle. Thus, freedom of thought and science can originate only in the state. It was the church that burnt Giordano Bruno and forced Galileo to recant. Science, therefore, must seek protection from the state, since the aim of science is knowledge of objective truth. After this promising start, Hegel proceeds to bring his opponents to the opposite of what their first impressions pronounce correct. The demand for freedom of thought is described as pretentious, and when faced with subversive opinions, the state must protect objective truth. Who is to judge what is objective truth? Hegel replies, the state has, in general, to make up its own mind concerning what is to be considered as objective truth. With this reply, freedom of thought and the claims of science to set its own standards give way to their opposite: liberty, equality, and the Prussian Constitution. Hegel's treatment of liberty and equality follows the same pattern. Kant had taught that liberty should be restricted, but not beyond what is necessary to safeguard an equal degree of freedom for all. Hegel knows Kant's solution, but he does not like it, and he presents it without mentioning its author in a disparaging way. Today, nothing is more familiar than the idea that each must restrict his liberty in relation to the liberty of others, that the state is a condition of such reciprocal restrictions, and that the laws are restrictions. But, he goes on, this expresses the kind of outlook that views freedom as casual good pleasure and self-will. With this cryptic remark, Kant's equalitarian theory of justice is dismissed. But Hegel himself feels that the little jest by which he equates liberty and law is not quite sufficient. He turns back to his original problem, that of the Constitution. The term political liberty, he says, is often used to mean a formal participation in the public affairs of the state by those who otherwise find their chief function in the particular aims and business of civil society. How to get out of this custom? By a merely verbal trick. By a definition, about this use of the term, the only thing to say is that by a constitution we must understand the determination of laws in general, that is to say, of liberties. But again, Hegel feels the appalling poverty of the argument, and in despair he dives into a collectivist mysticism and into historicism. The question to whom belongs the power of making a constitution is the same as who has to make the spirit of a nation. Separate your idea of a constitution from that of a collective spirit, and your fancy proves how superficially you have apprehended the nexus. It is the indwelling spirit and the history of the nation, which only is that spirit's history, by which constitutions have been and are made. Absolute monarchy as the apex of freedom. One must be more specific, and Hegel now hastens to be so. The really living totality, he writes, that which preserves and continually produces the state and its constitution, is the government. In the government, regarded as an organic totality, the sovereign power or principate is the all-sustaining, all-decreeing will of the state, its highest peak and all-pervasive unity. In the perfect form of the state in which each and every element has reached its free existence, this will is that of one actual decreeing individual, not merely of a majority in which the unity of the decreeing will has no actual existence. It is monarchy. The monarchical constitution is therefore the constitution of developed reason. Plato's philosophy, which once had claimed mastership in the state, becomes with Hegel its most servile lackey. These despicable services, Popper notes, were rendered voluntarily. When Hegel published his encyclopedia, he was professor in Heidelberg, and immediately after the publication, he was called to Berlin to become, as his admirers say, the acknowledged dictator of philosophy. Quote, the monarchical constitution is therefore the constitution of developed reason. Philosophy of history, apology for God and for Prussia. Hegel teaches that everything is in flux, even essences, and the latest stage of every development must be reasonable, and therefore good and true, for it is the apex of all past developments. It is clear that this must hold for history also. For Hegel, history becomes an open book, a book of pure apologetic. By its appeal to the wisdom of providence, it offers an apology for the excellence of Prussian monarchism. By its appeal to the excellence of Prussian monarchism, it offers an apology for the wisdom of providence. History is the development of something real. According to the philosophy of identity, it must therefore be something rational. History, as Hegel sees it, is the thought process of the absolute spirit or world spirit. Hegel subdivides universal history into three dialectical steps: Oriental despotism, the Greek and Roman democracies and aristocracies, and the Germanic monarchy, which of course is an absolute monarchy. He subdivides the third period into Reformation, post-Reformation statecraft, and modern times dating from the end of the last century, i.e. the period from 1800 down to 1830. Hegel proves again that this present Prussia is the pinnacle and the stronghold and the goal of freedom. Freedom is the sole truth of spirit. And indeed, the German spirit is the spirit of the New World. Its aim is the realization of absolute truth as the unlimited self-determination of freedom. After a eulogy of Prussia, whose government rests with the official world, whose apex is the personal decision of the monarch, Hegel reaches the crowning conclusion. This is the point which consciousness has attained, and these are the principal phases of that form in which freedom has realized itself. For the history of the world is nothing but the development of the idea of freedom. That the history of the world is the realization of spirit. This is the true theodicy, the justification of God in history. What has happened and is happening is essentially his work. Popper asks whether he was not justified when he said that Hegel presents us with an apology for God and for Prussia at the same time, and whether it is not clear that the state which Hegel commands us to worship as the divine idea on earth is not simply Frederick William's Prussia from 1800 to 1830. History is our judge. Since history and providence have brought the existing powers into being, there must be right, even divine right. But this moral positivism does not fully satisfy Hegel. He wants more. Just as he opposes liberty and equality, so he opposes the brotherhood of man, humanitarianism, or, as he says, philanthropy. Conscience must be replaced by blind obedience and by a romantic Heraclitean ethics of fame and fate, and the brotherhood of man by a totalitarian nationalism. Theodicy, Hegel's justification of God through the rational unfolding of freedom in history, culminating, conveniently, in Prussia. Moral positivism, what history has willed must be right. Success on the stage of history is the sole ethical criterion. Quote, that the history of the world is the realization of spirit. This is the true theodicy, the justification of God in history. What has happened and is happening is essentially his work. The rise of German nationalism and the new tribalism. Popper now proceeds to a brief sketch of the rise of German nationalism. Undoubtedly, the tendencies denoted by this term have a strong affinity with the revolt against reason and the open society. Nationalism appeals to our tribal instincts, to passion and to prejudice, and to our nostalgic desire to be relieved from the strain of individual responsibility which it attempts to replace by a collective or group responsibility. The oldest works on political theory, even that of the old oligarch, but more markedly those of Plato and of Aristotle, express decidedly nationalist views, for these works were written in an attempt to combat the open society and cosmopolitan equalitarianism. But this early development stops short with Aristotle. From Alexander onward, all the civilized states of Europe and Asia were empires, embracing populations of infinitely mixed origin. When nationalism was revived 100 years ago, it was in one of the most mixed of all the thoroughly mixed regions of Europe, in Germany, and especially in Prussia with its largely Slav population. Tribalism, the appeal to collective identity, passion, and inherited belonging against individual responsibility and cosmopolitan institutions. National state, the political demand that every state's territory coincide with one nation's territory, a myth Popper insists never clearly conceived. Herder, Fichte, and the oracular method. Herder maintained that a good state should have natural borders coinciding with the places inhabited by its nation. Kant at once realized the dangerous, irrational romanticism in this work of Herder's. A sagacity quick in picking up analogies, and an imagination audacious in the use it makes of them, are combined with a capability for enlisting emotions and passions in order to obtain interest for its object, an object that is always veiled in mystery. Synonyms are passed off as explanations, and allegories are offered as truths. It was Fichte who provided German nationalism with its first theory. The borders of a nation are determined by language. Fichte's career is instructive. In 1793, he defended Rousseau and the French Revolution. By 1806, the transformation of Fichte, the cosmopolitan, into Fichte the nationalist was completed. His first book was published anonymously under the title Critique of All Revelation, a clever copy of Kant's style. When the press extolled it as Kant's, Kant was forced to make a public statement that the work was Fichte's and later to dissociate himself with the words, "May God protect us from our friends. From our enemies, we could try to protect ourselves." Popper follows Schopenhauer in distinguishing between Fichte's windbaggery and Hegel's charlatanry. The whole story throws light upon the history of philosophy and upon history in general. Such clowns are taken seriously, made objects of worship and examination papers, and eulogist historians of philosophy, unable to discriminate between thought and fancy, dare to pronounce that their history is our judge. Hegel tames revolutionary nationalism. At the time when Fichte became the apostle of nationalism, an instinctive and revolutionary nationalism was rising in Germany as a reaction to the Napoleonic invasion, a typical tribal reaction against the expansion of a supranational empire. The people demanded democratic reforms in the sense of Rousseau and of the French Revolution, but without their French conquerors. This early nationalism arose as a cloak in which a humanitarian desire for freedom and equality was clad. After the wars of liberation, Frederick William met the danger first by dismissing his nationalist advisors, and then by appointing Hegel. The spiritual, Hegel says, is now the essential basis of the potential fabric, and philosophy has thereby become dominant. We should not, therefore, contradict the assertion that the revolution received its first impulse from philosophy. Part of Hegel's task was the perversion of the ideas of freedom and equality, but perhaps an even more urgent task was the taming of the revolutionary nationalist religion. Hegel fulfilled this task in the spirit of Pareto's advice, to take advantage of sentiments, not wasting one's energies in futile efforts to destroy them. He tamed nationalism not by outspoken opposition, but by transforming it into a well-disciplined Prussian authoritarianism. Hegel attacked liberal nationalists openly. Some men have recently begun to talk of the sovereignty of the people in opposition to the sovereignty of the monarch. But when it is contrasted with the sovereignty of a monarch, then the phrase sovereignty of the people turns out to be merely one of those confused notions which arise from a wild idea of the people. Without its monarch, the people are just a formless multitude. He referred to England as the most characteristic example of a nation in the bad sense, backward in legislation, sacrificing objective freedom to formal right and private interest. Yet Hegel knew that his task was to persuade nationalists that their collectivist demands are automatically realized by an almighty state. The nation-state is spirit in its substantive rationality and immediate actuality. It is therefore the absolute power on earth. The state is the spirit of the people itself. History is the contest of the various national spirits for world domination. Hegel introduced the historical theory of the nation. A nation is united by a spirit that acts in history, by the common foe, and by the comradeship of the wars it has fought. Popper remarks that a nation in Hegel's sense is a number of men united by a common error in regard to their history. Quote, "Without its monarch, the people are just a formless multitude." Hegel's racialist airs, spirit transubstantiated into blood. In our own time, Hegel's hysterical historicism is still the fertilizer to which modern totalitarianism owes its rapid growth. Its use has prepared the ground and has educated the intelligentsia to intellectual dishonesty. Modern totalitarianism is only an episode within the perennial revolt against freedom and reason. What distinguishes it is that its leaders succeeded in making the revolt a popular movement, made possible by the breakdown of social democracy, which in the minds of working people had stood for freedom and equality. Fascism had to take over part of the heritage of Marxism. It has not much use for an open appeal to the supernatural, and added to its official ideology some admixture of 19th century evolutionist materialism. Thus, the formula of the fascist brew is in all countries the same. Hegel plus a dash of 19th century materialism, especially Darwinism in the somewhat crude form given to it by Hegel. This scientific element in racialism can be traced back to Hegel, who in 1900 sponsored a prize competition on what Darwinism teaches about the internal and political development of a state. The first prize went to W. Schallmeyer, grandfather of racial biology. This materialist racialism resembles Plato's naturalism. Degeneration of the upper classes is at the root of political decay. The modern myth of blood and soil has its counterpart in Plato's myth of the earthborn. Nevertheless, not Hegel plus Plato, but Hegel plus Hegel is the formula of modern racialism. Marx replaced Hegel's spirit by matter and economic interests. Racialism substitutes blood or race. Instead of spirit, blood is the self-developing essence, the sovereign of the world, displaying itself on the stage of history. The blood of a nation determines its essential destiny. Hegel plus Hegel, Popper's formula for fascist ideology. Historicist metaphysics plus crude evolutionist biology. Metabiology, Shaw's phrase for religions that must transcend mere biology while claiming scientific sanction, apt for racial mysticism. Quote, thus the formula of the fascist brew is in all countries the same. Hegel plus a dash of 19th century materialism, especially Darwinism in the somewhat crude form given to it by Hegel. The armory of authoritarian ideas. The transubstantiation of Hegelianism into racialism does not greatly alter the main tendency of Hegelianism. It only gives it a tinge of biology and modern evolutionism. Nearly all the more important ideas of modern totalitarianism are directly inherited from Hegel, who collected and preserved what Zimmerman calls the armory of weapons for authoritarian movements. Popper lists them. A. Nationalism as the incarnation of spirit or blood, with one chosen nation destined for world domination. B. The state as the natural enemy of all other states, asserting itself in war. C. The state exempt from moral obligation. Historical success the sole judge. Collective utility the sole principle of conduct. Propagandist lying permissible. D. The ethical idea of war. War, fate, and fame as most desirable goods. E. The creative role of the great man, the world historical personality. F. The ideal of the heroic life, live dangerously, against petty bourgeois mediocrity. The Hegelian armory examined. Nationalism, inferiority, and world domination. According to Hegel, in the existence of a nation, the substantial aim is to be a state and preserve itself as such. A nation that has not formed itself into a state has, strictly speaking, no history. The state is the basis and center of all the concrete elements in the life of a people, of art, law, morals, religion, and science. The substance that exists in the state is the spirit of the people itself. Since the state must be powerful, it must contest the powers of other states, assert itself on the stage of history, and ultimately aim at world domination. The self-consciousness of a particular nation is the objective actuality in which the spirit of the time invests its will. Against this absolute will the other particular national minds have no rights. That nation dominates the world. Hegel also foresaw the psychological possibilities of nationalism. He saw that nationalism answers a need, the desire of men to find and to know their definite place in the world and to belong to a powerful collective body. He exhibits that characteristic of German nationalism, its strongly developed feelings of inferiority, especially towards the English. Every Englishman, Hegel writes, will say, "We are the men who navigate the ocean and who have the commerce of the world." The relation of the individual man to that spirit is that it enables him to have a definite place in the world, to be something. War, the state, and the rejection of eternal peace. A theory common to Hegel and his racialist followers is that the state by its very essence can exist only through its contrast to other states. Should we attempt to regulate affairs by adopting Kant's plans for eternal peace through a federal union? Certainly not, says Hegel. Kant proposed an alliance of princes. But the state, however, is an individual, and in individuality, negation is essentially contained. The state must create opposition and so beget an enemy. In the philosophy of law, the relation among states fluctuates, and no judge exists to adjust their differences. States may enter into mutual agreements, but they are, at the same time, superior to these agreements. The only possible standard of judgment upon world historical deeds is their result, their success. Out of this dialectic rises the universal spirit, pronouncing its judgment, and its judgment is the highest, upon the finite nations of the world's history, for the history of the world is the world's court of justice. Moral positivism and the great man. The state is the realization of the ethical idea. There can be no ethical idea above the state. When the particular wills of the states can come to no agreement, their controversy can be decided only by war. Hegel identifies true morality with social virtue in opposition to personal conscience. We may fairly establish the true principles of morality, or rather of social virtue, in opposition to false morality. For the history of the world occupies a higher ground than that morality, which is personal in character, the conscience of individuals. What the absolute aim of spirit requires and accomplishes transcends the imputation of good and bad motives. The deeds of great men must not be brought into collision with irrelevant moral claims. Nothing great in the world has been accomplished without passion. Passions, private aims, and the satisfaction of selfish desires are most effective springs of action. Their power lies in the fact that they respect none of the limitations which justice and morality would impose on them. Live dangerously, the heroic life against civilization. The tribal ideal of the heroic man, especially in its fascist form, is a direct attack upon those things which make heroism admirable, such as the furthering of civilization. Live dangerously is its imperative. The cause is of secondary importance. Hegel writes, "In peace, civil life becomes more extended, every sphere is hedged in, and at last all men stagnate. It is necessary to recognize property and life as accidental. Let insecurity finally come in the form of hussars with glistening sabers, and show its earnest activity." Hegel bases his anti-utilitarian attitude on his interpretation of history. The history of the world is no theater of happiness. Periods of happiness are blank pages in it, for they are periods of harmony. Liberalism, freedom, and reason are, as usual, objects of Hegel's attacks. Quote, "Let insecurity finally come in the form of hussars with glistening sabers, and show its earnest activity." Heidegger, Jaspers, and the philosophy of nothingness. Popper extends his indictment to Hegel's 20th century heirs. Heidegger revived Hegel's philosophy of nothingness. Pure being and pure nothingness are identical. If you try to think pure being, you must abstract from all determinations, and therefore, nothing remains. Heidegger applies this to a practical philosophy of life. Life can be understood only by understanding nothingness. Fear reveals nothingness. Human existence is to be cast down into existence, directed towards death. Yet Heidegger's 1933 proclamation that science and German destiny must attain power shows loyalty to his masters. Jaspers carries nihilist tendencies further. Only when faced with nothingness and annihilation can one experience existence. One must not only risk, but lose to taste life. Enjoy yourself perishing. This is the philosophy of the gambler, of the gangster. Schopenhauer's advice remains pertinent. Should you ever intend to dull the wits of a young man and to incapacitate his brains for any kind of thought whatever, then you cannot do better than give him Hegel to read. Thus, any ability to think is so thoroughly destroyed that the young man will ultimately mistake empty and hollow verbiage for real thought. There is another Germany, Popper concedes, that of ordinary people whose brains have not been poisoned by a devastating system of higher education. But this other Germany is certainly not that of her thinkers. Philosophy of nothingness. The Hegelian Heideggerian identification of being and nothing turned into an ethics of fear and annihilation. Existentialism. Jasper's doctrine that authentic life is found only on the edge between existence and nothingness. Quote, "Should you ever intend to dull the wits of a young man and to incapacitate his brains for any kind of thought whatever, then you cannot do better than give him Hegel to read." Popper's verdict. Hegel as enemy of the open society. Popper has tried to show the identity of Hegelian historicism with the philosophy of modern totalitarianism. This identity is seldom clearly enough realized. Hegelian historicism has become the language of wide circles of intellectuals. Even of candid anti-fascists and leftists, it is so much a part of their intellectual atmosphere that, for many, it is no more noticeable, and its appalling dishonesty no more remarkable than the air they breathe. Some racial philosophers are fully conscious of their indebtedness to Hegel. H.O. Ziegler describes the introduction of Hegel's idea of collective spirits conceived as personalities as the Copernican revolution in the philosophy of the nation. Popper is ready to admit one idea in Hegel that might be claimed as important: the awareness that men cannot start with a blank, creating a world of thought from nothing. Their thoughts are largely the product of an intellectual inheritance. But Popper denies that this was Hegel's own contribution. It was the common property of the Romantics, going back to Edmund Burke. In Hegel, it appears only in the exaggerated form of historical relativism, the dangerous doctrine that what is believed today is, in fact, true today, and that what was true yesterday may be false tomorrow. Continuing Schopenhauer's fight. It is difficult and urgent to continue Schopenhauer's fight against this shallow cant, which Hegel himself accurately fathomed when describing his own philosophy as of the most lofty depth. At least the new generation should be helped to free themselves from this intellectual fraud, the greatest, perhaps, in the history of our civilization. Schopenhauer prophesied in 1840 that this colossal mystification will furnish posterity with an inexhaustible source of sarcasm. So far, the great pessimist has proved a wild optimist concerning posterity. The Hegelian farce has done enough harm. We must stop it. We must speak, even at the price of soiling ourselves by touching this scandalous thing which, unfortunately without success, was so clearly exposed 100 years ago. Too many philosophers have neglected Schopenhauer's incessantly repeated warnings. They neglected them not so much at their own peril as at the peril of those whom they taught, and at the peril of mankind. Popper leaves the last word to Schopenhauer, the anti-nationalist who said of Hegel 100 years ago, "He exerted, not on philosophy alone, but on all forms of German literature, a devastating, or more strictly speaking, a stupefying, one could also say a pestiferous influence. To combat this influence forcefully and on every occasion is the duty of everybody who is able to judge independently. For if we are silent, who will speak?" Intellectual dishonesty. The cultivated inability to distinguish Hegelian cant from reason, a precondition of totalitarian politics. Open society. The civilization of critical discussion, individual responsibility, and institutions that submit to rational reform rather than historical destiny. Quote, "To combat this influence forcefully and on every occasion is the duty of everybody who is able to judge independently. For if we are silent, who will speak?" Chapter 13. Marx's Sociological Determinism. Marxism enters the humanitarian camp by a route that has proved more successful than Plato's justice, Rousseau's general will, or Hegel's national freedom. It inherits Hegelian historicism, yet claims the moral passion of the oppressed. I do not wish to deny the difference. Marx's impulse is humanitarian. Unlike the right Hegelians, he tried to apply rational methods to urgent social problems. Science advances by trial and error, and Marx tried. He opened eyes even where he erred. A return to pre-Marxian social science is inconceivable. One cannot do him justice without recognizing his sincerity, his sense of facts, his hatred of moralizing verbiage, and his demand that theory prove itself in deeds. Yet in spite of these merits, I believe Marx was a false prophet, not chiefly because his prophecies failed, but because he persuaded intelligent people that historical prophecy is the scientific way to approach social problems. That historicist influence within the movement for an open society is, I think, the graver charge. Historicism versus social technology. The common inference from Russian experiments, that Marxism must be a kind of social technology, is a mistake anyone acquainted with Marxism's history should avoid. Marxism is a purely historical theory aimed at predicting economic development and revolutions. It did not furnish the basis of Bolshevik policy after 1917. Lenin admitted that Marxism could not help in practical economics. I do not know of any socialist who has dealt with these problems. There was nothing written about such matters in the Bolshevik textbooks. The NEP and later five-year plans have nothing to do with scientific socialism, as Marx and Engels propounded it. Marx's vast economic researches did not touch constructive policy. Apart from useless slogans such as "from each according to his ability" to "each according to his needs," there is hardly a word on the economics of socialism, because his research serves historical prophecy, not rational planning. He denounced attempts at economic analysis for planning purposes as utopian and illegitimate. Marxists were therefore less prepared for constructive work than many bourgeois economists. Scientific socialism. Marx's mission was to free socialism from sentimental utopianism by basing it on causal analysis and prediction. But he identified social prediction with historical prophecy, so science meant foretelling socialism's advent rather than designing institutions. When attacked, Marxists often retreat to the claim that Marxism is fundamentally a method, not a doctrine. That is correct. It is wrong to think the method is immune to criticism. Whoever judges Marxism must measure it by methodological standards and ask whether it furthers science. By calling it purist historicism, I indicate that I hold the Marxist method very poor indeed. Quote, Marxism is a purely historical theory, a theory which aims at predicting the future course of economic and power political developments, and especially of revolutions. As such, it certainly did not furnish the basis of the policy of the Russian Communist Party after its rise to political power. Determinism, prophecy, and the ship of history. Marx's pragmatic stress on the fruits of theory. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, led him to treat scientific prediction as central. The plausible argument that science can predict the future only if the future is predetermined pushed him toward rigid determinism and inexorable laws. That link between scientific and determinist is now a superstition. Physics has shown that strict determinism is not a necessary assumption of a science that makes predictions. Marx cannot be blamed for sharing the error of his age. What led him astray was not abstract determinism, but its practical influence on his view of social science's aims. The belief in scientific fortune-telling rests on a second confusion between scientific prediction, as in astronomy, and large-scale historical prophecy of society's main tendencies. The scientific character of the first is no argument for the second. Historicism then upset the pragmatism that had led Marx to stress prediction. If history is predetermined, neither goodwill nor reason can alter its main course. Reasonable interference shrinks to prophecy of the impending development and removal of obstacles in its path. Quote, when a society has discovered the natural law that determines its own movement, even then it can neither overleap the natural phases of its evolution, nor shuffle them out of the world by a stroke of the pen. But this much it can do. It can shorten and lessen its birth pangs. Marx therefore denounced, as utopianists, all who treated institutions as amenable to rational planning. They seemed to him to steer the colossal ship of society against history's currents with fragile hands. The scientist could only forecast storms and advise which side of the boat to assemble on. Scientific socialism announces the impending socialist millennium. It does not teach how to construct socialist institutions. Marx, Mill, and the rejection of psychologism. Marx's historicist attitude was typical of his time. The French Revolution, still vivid, 1848, reviving it. He thought such upheavals could not be planned, but could have been foreseen by historicist science. The parallel with J.S. Mill is striking. Mill too sought the law by which one state of society produces the next, distinguished social technology from historicist prophecy, and chose prophecy as the general science of society. Marx dismissed Mill as insipid syncretism, yet their programs converge when Marx speaks of laying bare the law of motion of modern society. The decisive difference is methodological. Mill's sociology must reduce to psychology and the laws of the mind, especially progressiveness. Marx challenged psychologism. Legal relationships cannot be explained by the general progressiveness of the human mind. To have questioned psychologism is perhaps Marx's greatest achievement as a sociologist. It opened the way to a partly autonomous sociology. In the following chapters, one shall develop that merit, and later show the fatal weakness of his historicism. Quote, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines his existence. Rather, it is his social existence that determines his consciousness." Chapter 14, The Autonomy of Sociology. Marx's famous epigram, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines his existence. Rather, it is his social existence that determines his consciousness," is the thread running through this chapter and the two that follow. My task is to elucidate it, and I may state at once that in developing what I take to be Marx's anti-psychologism, I am developing a view to which I subscribe myself. Psychologism and the exogamy test. Psychologism holds that all laws of social life must ultimately reduce to psychological laws of human nature. Mill's school would explain widespread exogamy by instinctive aversion to incest. Marx's epigram invites the reverse question, whether the apparent instinct is rather the product of social rules demanding exogamy. The snake fear experiments are a warning. Even behavior shared by men and anthropoid apes may be conventional, produced by education rather than instinct. Universal occurrence is not decisive for instinct. The converse, that non-universal habits argue against instinct, is also unsafe. Against psychologism, institutionalists point out that no action is explained by motive alone. Motives must be supplemented by the situation, especially the social environment. Institutions and their functioning cannot be reduced to a psychological or behavioristic analysis of actions. Such analysis presupposes sociology. Psychologists reply that social structure is man-made and must therefore be explicable from human nature. Markets from economic man, traditions from forgotten motives, and tolerance of obscure institutions. Mill's sane opposition to holism is praiseworthy. Collectives must be reduced to individuals. But methodological individualism does not imply psychologism. Methodological individualism, the behavior of states and groups, must be reduced to the actions of human individuals. Psychologism wrongly infers that this reduction must be psychological. Historicism, conspiracy, and situational logic. Psychologism forces us into speculations about origins and development. Mill's psychologism drives him toward historicism and barren a priori history. Marx's anti-psychologism blocks that route. Another doctrine blocked is the conspiracy theory of society, the view that all social phenomena, including unintended results, are intended by interested parties. Buying a house raises prices though the buyer does not intend it. Insuring one's life encourages investment in insurance shares. Not all consequences are intended. Society is not a conspiracy. Psychologists may retort that sellers' hopes explain these repercussions. But hope and knowledge are not ultimate data. They are explicable through market situations that are hardly reducible to human nature. The social sciences must study unintended repercussions and the logic of situations without Mill's prejudice that no generalization may enter social science until grounded in human nature. Situational logic. Actions are largely explicable through the logic of the situation. Economic analysis and the logic of power are examples. Rational and irrational behavior mean conformity or nonconformity to that situational logic, not a prior psychological assumption about human nature. My attack on psychologism is not an attack on psychology. Psychology is one of the social sciences, not their basis. Concepts such as craving for power or the strain of civilization are simultaneously psychological and sociological. They relate feelings to social situations such as the contrast between open and closed society. Psychologism's merit is methodological individualism. Its mistake is presuming that individualism requires reducing all social regularities to psychological laws, a presumption that inclines toward historicism. Where psychologism is right, it insists that we explain institutions through the decisions and actions of persons, never through reified collectives. Where it goes wrong, it denies that institutions and situations have structures of their own that constrain and enable those persons. Beyond Marx's immediate targets. In defending Marx's view that social problems are irreducible to human nature, I have gone beyond his explicit arguments. He did not use the term psychologism or systematically criticize Mill. His epigram was aimed at Hegelian idealism. Yet on the psychological nature of society, Mill's psychologism coincides with the idealism Marx combated. Historically, Marx extracted valuable suggestions even from absurd Hegelian collectivism, the superiority of society over the individual, turning them against other Hegelian doctrines. I have preferred Mill as the worthier opponent and developed Marx's case in that form. Quote, "The main task of the social sciences is analyzing the unintended social repercussions of intentional human actions, those repercussions whose significance is neglected both by the conspiracy theory and by psychologism." Chapter 15, Economic Historicism. Many believe Marx taught the all-pervading influence of the economic motive, explained greed by man's need to live, and showed class interest driving history, the essence of historical materialism. Such opinions are common. I have no doubt they misinterpret Marx. Those who admire him for holding them I call vulgar Marxists. The average vulgar Marxist thinks Marxism exposes hidden motives of greed behind war, depression, and hunger. He may try to reconcile Marx with Freud and Adler, listing hunger, love, and lust for power as the three great hidden motives of human nature. Whether attractive or not, this has little to do with Marx's historical materialism. What Marx actually meant. Marx sometimes mentions greed and the profit motive, but not to explain history. He treats them as symptoms of corrupting social institutions, effects, not causes. War, depression, unemployment, and hunger in the midst of plenty are not cunning conspiracies of big business, but unwanted consequences of actions directed toward other ends by agents caught in the social system. Historical actors, including the big ones, are puppets pulled by economic wires in the kingdom of necessity, until one day the puppets destroy the system and attain the kingdom of freedom. Most followers have abandoned this doctrine for a vulgar conspiracy theory, a sad come down from the level of capital to that of the myth of the 20th century. Marx agrees with Mill that social phenomena must be explained historically. He departs from Mill's psychologism, Hegel's idealism, and replaces it with materialism, often misunderstood. The charge that Marx recognizes only lower, material life is an ancient libel. He was influenced by 18th century French materialists, yet remained, in important passages, a practical dualist. Mind is another form of matter in theory, but in practice different. Feet on material ground, heads with thoughts. Practical dualism. Marx inverted Hegel. Thought is superstructure on physical basis, yet in practice cherished freedom as spiritual and hated bondage to material necessity. Kingdom of necessity and kingdom of freedom. Marx loved real freedom, not Hegel's. He followed Hegel's equation of freedom with spirit, yet recognized that we are spirit and flesh fundamental. In Capital, he describes economic life as extension of human metabolism. Freedom is limited by metabolic necessity. All we can achieve is to conduct metabolism rationally, with minimum energy and dignified conditions, yet remains the kingdom of necessity. The kingdom of freedom actually begins only where drudgery, enforced by hardship and by external purposes, ends. The shortening of the labor day is the fundamental prerequisite. Scientific treatment of society is possible only where society is determined by its past. Science deals with the kingdom of necessity. Free spiritual activity, if it existed, would lie beyond science, which must ask for causes. Thoughts can be treated scientifically only through material conditions of their origin and assimilation. Hence, as ideological superstructures on the basis of economic conditions. Marx's economism opposes Hegel's idealism and Mill's psychologism. It must not be confused with depreciatory materialism toward mental life. His vision of equitable partial liberation from material bondage is rather idealistic. Appreciation and criticism. Marx's economism can be distinguished from his historicism. Historicism, the claim that social science coincides with historical prophecy, must be dismissed. Economism, the claim that economic organization is fundamental for institutions and their development, is sound if fundamental is taken in an ordinary vague sense. Practically all social studies profit from attention to economic conditions. Even the history of mathematics is no exception. But Marx, trained in Hegel's reality-appearance distinction, took fundamental too seriously. Essentialism led to overemphasis. Economic conditions may illuminate mathematical history, but knowledge of mathematical problems matters more, and one can write excellent history without economic background. Sweeping economism, the doctrine that all development depends on the physical means of production, is palpably false. Ideas and economic conditions interact. Destroy machinery, but preserve technical knowledge, and society may rebuild. Destroy knowledge while preserving machines, and savages would erase civilization. Marxism's own history falsifies exaggerated economism. Workers of all countries unite, shaped events until the Russian Revolution. Then Lenin admitted there were no constructive ideas until he added electrification to dictatorship, and enthusiasm for an idea transformed 1/6 of the world. Marx underrated the kingdom of freedom's power to conquer necessity. The Russian Revolution cannot be identified with his social revolution. Political revolutions that merely exchange rulers are not essential change for Marx. Yet Lenin's revolution was precisely such an idea-driven political transformation. Quote, "In considering such revolutions, it is necessary always to distinguish between the material revolution and the economic conditions of production, which fall within the scope of exact scientific determination, and the juridical, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in a word, ideological forms of appearance." His materialist interpretation of history is valuable as a suggestion to consider things in relation to their economic background, not as a metaphysics to be taken too seriously. Chapter 16. The Classes. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle, occupies an important place among formulations of historical materialism. History is propelled by class war, not national war. In explaining developments, including national wars, class interest replaces alleged national interest. Class struggle can also explain trends traditional history may record, but not explain, such as increasing productivity. Capital analyses how, within capitalism, productivity rises through these forces. Objective class interest and the social net. How does class war relate to the autonomy of sociology? At first sight, class interest looks psychological. Yet nobody who grasps Marx's anti-psychologism can reconcile the two only by vulgar Marxist psychologism. Where Marx seriously uses class interest, he means an institutional, objective thing, a situation advantageous to a class, not a state of mind. Objective interest becomes conscious in subjective minds, Hegelian jargon. More precisely, members become conscious of their class situation. The epigram of Chapter 14 applies. Social existence, especially class position, determines consciousness. Marx argues that emancipation from the productive process requires making others do dirty work, degrading them, splitting mankind into classes. The ruling class gains freedom at the cost of the ruled. Rulers must oppress to preserve status, bound to the social metabolism. All are caught in the net and forced to fight. This bondage brings struggle within reach of scientific prophecy. The social net is the economic structure, the social system. Systems change with conditions of production. Historical periods are best characterized by class systems: feudalism, capitalism. The hand mill gives you a society with the feudal lord. The steam mill gives you a society with the industrial capitalist. Logic of the social situation. The social system works blindly. Individuals cannot foresee remote repercussions or plan improvement from within. Social engineering is impossible. The system forces upon us what we believe to be our interests. The capitalist is a mere function of the capital which, through his instrumentality, is endowed with will and consciousness. Competition forces extension of capital. Ideas are instruments and social actions, so the system determines thought. Class struggle and intraclass competition make objective interest conscious. Historicist overstatement and sociological merit. My criticism of the historicist emphasis follows Chapter 15. All history is class struggle is valuable as a suggestion to examine class struggle in power politics and other developments. Plato's analysis was rarely taken up later, but we must not take all too seriously. Intraclass dissension, for example, popes versus emperors, cannot be read as exploiter versus exploited without emptying the doctrine into tautology. The formula misleads Marxists into interpreting every conflict as exploiters versus exploited, excusing aggression, as when some German Marxists read the First World War as revolutionary Central Powers against conservative have countries. Yet Marx's logic of the class situation, in analyzing unrestrained capitalism of a century ago, is admirable sociological analysis despite exaggeration and neglected aspects. Quote, only insofar as the capitalist is personified capital does he play a historical role. But exactly to that extent, his motive is not to obtain and to enjoy useful commodities, but to increase the production of commodities for exchange. Even capitalists play their historical role, driving production for production's sake and creating material conditions for a higher society whose principle is the full and free development of every individual. Class consciousness, Klassenbewusstsein, means more than awareness of class situation. It suggests pride, solidarity, and historical mission. Marx applies it chiefly to workers who must be Marxists if class conscious, since theory and prophecy are part of the process by which class situation emerges into consciousness. Chapter 17. The Legal and the Social System. We approach what is probably the most crucial point in our analysis and criticism of Marxism. Marx's theory of the state and, paradoxical as it may sound, the impotence of all politics. State, superstructure, and political impotence. For Marx, the legal political system is a superstructure on the economic system, juridical and political superstructures. Morality, not state-enforced, is another superstructure sanctioned by ruling class ideology. The difference is roughly persuasion versus force. Engels calls the state a special repressive force. The manifesto says political power is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing the other. The state is machinery by which the ruling class carries on its struggle. The theory is partly institutional, what functions legal institutions serve, and partly essentialist. Marx asks, what is the state, rather than what reforms would make it serve desirable ends. Essentialism cannot be answered satisfactorily, yet fits Marx's metaphysical approach, treating ideas as appearance of economic reality. The chief consequence, politics is impotent. Politics cannot decisively alter economic reality. Enlightened political activity keeps juridical forms pace with changes in production and class relations, or expresses volcanic revolutions foreseen from the social system, perhaps mitigated by non-resistance, but cannot cause or suppress them. Marxism stimulated political action, yet teaches fundamental political impotence. A paradox Marxists meet by saying political fight awakens class consciousness, radical wing, or that in periods of class equilibrium political effort helps workers, moderate wing, a sacrifice of fundamentals. Under this theory, the Workers' Party can hardly make important political mistakes while pressing workers' claims, since politics cannot materially affect class situation or economic reality. In principle, all government, even democracy, is class dictatorship. The executive of the modern state is merely a committee for managing the economic affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. After revolution, proletarian dictatorship must wither away when resistance ends, since one-class society means classless society and a state without function. Formal freedom, material freedom, and the paradox of freedom. I do not defend Marx's theory of impotence or his view of democracy. They seem fatal mistakes. Yet grim experience stood behind them. Marx's theory illuminates his period, the Industrial Revolution as transformation of material means of production, then class structure, then legal change. Legislative measures fostered developments Marx analyzed. He first discussed economic influence on legislation and laws, creating a surplus population. Shameless exploitation was cynically defended by appeal to freedom of contract and equal and free competition for all. Labor legislation was resisted until 1833 and poorly enforced long after. Marx's Capital burns with protest against child labor and Mary and Walkley's death from overwork in an overcrowded room. The coroner finding apoplexy accelerated by overwork. In view of such experience, one need not wonder Marx saw parliamentary democracy as veiled bourgeois dictatorship. In Capital, Marx analyses capitalism assuming perfect legal equality. Yet even under just exchange of labor power for value, workers cannot enjoy freedom. Exploitation is not mere robbery eliminable by law alone. Hence formal versus material freedom. Legal freedom is insufficient. Real freedom requires emancipation from drudgery, and the shortening of the labor day is the fundamental prerequisite. Are politics intrinsically impotent to remedy this? Defenders of unrestrained capitalism stress free markets. I believe the injustice Marx described is real, but interpretable through the paradox of freedom. Unlimited freedom lets the strong bully the weak. We demand the state limit freedom, so everyone's freedom is protected. That argument must apply to the economic realm. Even if physical violence is suppressed, the economically strong may bully the economically weak. Those with surplus food can force the starving into freely accepted servitude. The remedy is political. Institutions protecting the economically weak, so nobody accepts inequitable terms from fear of starvation. Unrestrained capitalism must give way to planned economic intervention. And this has happened. Interventionist systems replaced Marx's unrestrained capitalism, not a state withering away. Political power, economic power, and democratic control. Here is the central clash between historicism and social engineering. Marxism claims to guide practice, yet teaches that we cannot alter economic reality by legal reforms. Politics can only shorten and lessen the birth pangs. That attributes third-rate importance to political power. Our analysis inverts this. Political power is fundamental and can control economic power. We can develop rational programs protecting the economically weak, limit exploitation and working hours, ensure against disability, unemployment, and old age, approaching completeness and freedom from economic fear. Political power is the key. Economic power must not dominate it. Marx's disparaging attitude toward politics neglects the greatest means of bettering the lot of the weak and the greatest danger to freedom. His naive view that in a classless society the state would wither away shows he never grasped the paradox of freedom. Mere formal freedom, democracy, the right to dismiss government, is the only known device protecting against misuse of political power and, through political control, against economic power. Marx discovered economic power's significance and exaggerated it. He who has the money has the power is roundabout. He who has the gun has power. Economic power depends on political protection of property. Without state sanctions, wealth vanishes. Russell's examples, Caesar defying creditors, Charles V and the Fuggers, show limits. Money is dangerous only when it can buy power or enslave the economically weak. We must think more materialistically than Marx about physical power and exploitation. Establish merely formal freedom. Learn to use it. Construct institutions for democratic control of economic power. We hold the keys. We must not blame economic demons when in democracy we can tame them. Intervention, institutions, and taming power. Marxists in practice assumed political power can control economics, but without clear refutation of impotence theory or adequate answer to controlling the controller. They retained proletarian dictatorship, extended state economic power without asking who might hold it, and kept holistic belief that only a new social system helps. Utopian engineering condemned in Chapter 9. Piecemeal intervention increases state power and is dangerous. State power remains necessary evil. We need watchfulness and democratic strengthening while intervening. Otherwise, we lose freedom and with it planning. Institutional long-term policy must supersede Plato's "who shall rule." The problem is designing institutions preventing bad rulers from too much damage. Analogously, in economic intervention, labor laws adding little discretionary power differ from laws conferring open-ended requisitioning power. Institutional, indirect, intervention builds a legal framework knowable and predictable. Personal, direct, intervention by discretionary officials is short-term, obscure, and breeds conspiracy theories. Democratic policy should prefer institutional methods. Direct intervention only where institutional means fail, budget, perhaps countercycle measures. Only institutional intervention permits trial and error and public discussion. Platoists, Hegelians, and Marxists block understanding. The question, who shall be the rulers, must be superseded by how can we tame them. Conclusion of the methodological critique. Marx's theory of impotence is an imposing edifice. Economic historicism, metabolism determining politics, humanitarian indignation, prophecy consoling the oppressed, comparable to Plato and Hegel. Accident that he was not reactionary explains philosophy's neglect of him as system builder. A reviewer of Capital was right. Idealist in the bad German sense, yet enormously more realistic than predecessors. Marx was the last great holistic system builder. We should leave it at that and not replace it with another great system. What we need is piecemeal social engineering. With this, I conclude the critical analysis of Marx's philosophy of social science. The final test is practical. The prophecy of a classless society, to which I now turn. Quote, unlimited economic freedom can be just as self-defeating as unlimited physical freedom, and economic power may be nearly as dangerous as physical violence. For those who possess a surplus of food can force those who are starving into a freely accepted servitude without using violence. Chapter 18. The Coming of Socialism. Economic historicism is the method Marx applied to analyze impending changes. Every social system must destroy itself by creating forces producing the next period. Analysis of feudalism before the Industrial Revolution might have detected forces destroying feudalism and predicted capitalism. Analysis of capitalism might detect forces for its destruction and predict the new period ahead. Capitalism has never changed material conditions so quickly. By transforming its own foundations, it is bound to produce a new epoch. The three steps of the prophetic argument. Marx's prophecy is a closely knit argument. Capital elaborates only the first step, fundamental economic forces and class relations. The second step, social revolution inevitable, and third, classless socialism, are sketched. I reverse the order for critical discussion, so each step's conclusion can be tested from its premises. First step, Chapter 20 Capitalist production tends toward increased productivity and accumulation. Socially, this tends toward wealth concentrated in fewer bourgeois hands and misery in the proletariat. Second step, Chapter 19 Middle classes disappear. Tension between bourgeoisie and proletariat leads to social revolution. Third step, this chapter workers win, eliminate bourgeoisie. One class remains, classless socialism. I take second step premises for granted and examine the third. Given elimination of all classes but a small bourgeoisie and huge proletariat, and misery forcing revolt. Workers must win. Eliminating bourgeoisie establishes classless society. I grant the first conclusion from those premises. Bourgeoisie are few, and their metabolism depends on proletarians. The exploiter starves without the exploited and cannot win a prolonged struggle. Workers can destroy class enemies without endangering subsistence. Bourgeoisie will disappear. Why classless society does not follow. Does the second conclusion follow? I do not think so. From one of two classes remaining, it does not follow that society is classless. Classes are not like individuals. Solidarity is partly product of class struggle. When common enemy pressure ceases, latent conflicts may divide the formerly united proletariat into new classes and new struggle. Dialectics might predict a new antithesis, though dialectics explains anything including classlessness. The likely development. Surviving revolutionary leaders and staff form a new class, a new aristocracy or bureaucracy, concealing this fact by retaining revolutionary ideology and exploiting fear of counter-revolution, a new opium for the people. On Marx's premises, such events are likely. My task is not to prophesy, but to show the conclusion does not follow. The third step is inconclusive. I do not prophesy that socialism will not come. Prolonged struggle and victory enthusiasm might produce solidarity until anti-exploitation institutions exist. Democratic control of rulers is the only guarantee. Chances depend on devotion to socialism and freedom versus immediate class interests. Class struggle does not always produce lasting solidarity. Privileged worker groups may exploit others after victory. Too many possibilities exist for historical prophecy. It is unscientific to ignore disliked possibilities. Wishful thinking is not scientific thinking. Prophecy offers escape from present responsibilities into future paradise and stresses individual helplessness before demonic economic forces. Experience alternatives and piecemeal engineering. Experience bears out theory if we guard against the Marxist prejudice that socialism is the only alternative to capitalism. Neither Marx nor anyone has shown that a classless society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all is the only successor to the ruthless system Marx named capitalism in 1845. Laissez-faire has disappeared worldwide without being replaced by Marxist socialism, except in Russia, where means of production are state-owned, but political power shows no inclination to wither away. Everywhere organized political power performs far-reaching economic functions. Russian, fascist, and democratic interventionism, England, America, Sweden. Factory legislation, the 48-hour week, unemployment insurance. Identifying modern democracies with Marx's capitalism is absurd compared with his 10-point communist program. Most points are realized in democracies to a considerable degree, plus steps Marx never imagined towards social security. Marxists rightly say democracies have not established socialism, if that means abolition of land property. Inferring they remain capitalist, in Marx's sense, only shows the dogmatic presupposition of no third alternative. Marxism blinds followers to what happens before their eyes. Could we strengthen premises to obtain valid prophecy? Any conclusion follows from sufficiently strong premises. But large-scale prophecy would require moral and ideological assumptions beyond reduction to economics, which Marx would call unscientific. Unorthodox Marxists admit socialism's coming depends on policy. Moral factors make the method inapplicable. Defenders say only two possibilities exist: eternal misery or eventual better world, and prophecy encourages the leap to socialism. Nobody has shown only capitalism and socialism exist. The alternative is piecemeal democratic intervention and social technology, not prophecy or violence. If reason cannot improve the world, it would be a miracle if irrational historical forces produced a better one. Moral and ideological factors influence history unpredictably. Social technologists may plan institutions and means of change. History does not become more predictable thereby. Marx was right that history cannot be planned on paper. Institutions can and are. Only by planning step-by-step institutions, safeguarding freedom from exploitation, can we hope for a better world. The prophecy's political consequences. Marx's historicist theory deeply influenced European communists and social democrats, both unprepared to transform society. Russian communists advanced unaware of sacrifice ahead. Central European social democrats shrank from responsibilities communists took, doubting any people but Russia's would endure revolution's cost, and uncertain of Russia's experiment from 1918 to 1926. The split was between irrational faith in Russia's success and reasonable skepticism. Yet by Marxism, the proletarian revolution should follow industrialization in advanced countries, not precede it in Russia. This is no defense of social democratic leaders whose policy was determined by implicit belief that socialism must come, combined with skepticism about immediate tasks. They organized workers and inspired faith in liberation, yet could not prepare realization. They knew scientific socialism, and that recipes for the future were utopian. Had not Marx ridiculed demands for Comtist recipes for the kitchen in which the future is cooked? Marxist leaders knew better than to waste time on technology. Workers of all countries unite, exhausted their practical program. When their hour struck, they left workers high and dry, waiting for capitalism's promised suicide, hoping after collapse, when discredit was less, to become saviors. The Great Depression they welcomed as promised collapse taught them workers tired of being fed interpretations of history. Fascism as capitalism's last stand before collapse. They needed more than that. Slowly, leaders saw the cost of waiting. It was too late. Quote, "The review positivist accuses me of metaphysical treatment of economics, and further, you would hardly guess it, of confining myself to a merely critical analysis of actual facts, instead of prescribing recipes, Comtist ones perhaps, for the kitchen in which the future is cooked." Chapter 19, The Social Revolution. The second step of Marx's prophetic argument takes as its most relevant premise that capitalism leads to increasing wealth in the declining bourgeoisie and misery in the growing proletariat, a premise criticized in the next chapter, but here granted. The conclusions divide into two parts. All classes except bourgeoisie and proletariat disappear, and increasing tension leads to proletarian social revolution. I believe neither conclusion follows. My criticism neglects many possible developments, as in Chapter 18. The first conclusion, class structure and solidarity. Marx's theory of increasing wealth and misery provides for disappearance of weaker capitalists and petty bourgeoisie. Each capitalist lays many of his fellows low, and for sinking of small tradespeople, handicraftsmen, and peasants into the proletariat. The description is fairly accurate for handicrafts and partly for peasants entering industrial work. But the movement is industrial. It does not mean all farmers become industrial workers or that agricultural laborers unite in solidarity with industrial proletarians. The dispersion of the rural workers over large areas breaks down their power of resistance at the very time when the concentration of capital increases the power of resistance of the urban workers, hardly unification. Farmers may support bourgeoisie. The manifesto's first demand, abolition of land property, hardly counters that tendency. Marx saw that bourgeoisie must foment division, a privileged stratum of wage earners feeling superior to manual workers, and use of the rabble proletariat as recruiting ground for criminals ready to sell themselves to the class enemy. Increasing misery swells this class without strengthening solidarity of the oppressed. Even industrial worker solidarity is not necessary. Misery produces resistance and rebellious outbreaks. But if misery cannot be alleviated until revolution, repeated defeat may produce consciousness of belonging to a beaten army rather than pride and historical mission, unless workers draw strength from growing numbers and power while other classes disappear. Since that need not happen, solidarity may be undermined by defeatism. On Marx's assumptions, a class structure may develop. Bourgeoisie, big landowners, other landowners, rural workers, new middle class, industrial workers, rabble proletariat, with combinations undermining unity of 6. The first conclusion does not follow. I do not replace Marx's prophecy with another. I assert alternatives may pass, which fascism illustrated. That possibility destroys the first conclusion and affects the second. Characterizing the social revolution. Marx's social revolution of the proletariat denotes transition from capitalism to socialism, a transitional period of class struggle until workers' victory. Violence is not necessarily implied, though prospects of avoiding civil war are not bright. From prophecy's viewpoint, the question is secondary. What matters is socialism. If capitalism's succession by socialism were intuitively certain, this would suffice, but we need social revolution inside the scientific argument. Defining it as transition to socialism makes the argument circular, like a doctor who knows only that the malady will become fatal. We need a characterization not referring to socialism. The social revolution is an attempt by a largely united proletariat to conquer complete political power, resolved not to shrink from violence if necessary, and to resist opponents regaining influence. Morally and legally, this is violent uprising. Historically, Marxism remains indefinite about actual use of force. Violence, democracy, and the radical wing. From practical politics, I consider this prophecy of possibly violent revolution the most harmful element in Marxism. I am not always against violent revolution. Under tyranny with no other possibility, revolution may be justified, but only to establish democracy. Institutions including elections permitting public control and dismissal of rulers, reforms without violence even against rulers' will. Violence is justified only under tyranny, making non-violent reform impossible, and should aim only at a state where reforms without violence become possible. Attempting more risks destroying prospects of reasonable reform. Prolonged violence may bring not reason, but the strong man. After democracy exists, violence is justified only in defensive resistance to attacks on democratic constitution, unambiguously defensive, never threatening counter-tyranny. Radical versus moderate Marxism. Radical and moderate wings, roughly communist and social democratic, both invoke Marx. Asked about justification, Marxists would agree violent revolution is justified only against tyranny. Then they diverge. Radicals. All-class rule is dictatorship. Real democracy requires classless society, overthrowing capitalist dictatorship if necessary. Moderates. Democracy can be realized under capitalism to some extent. Peaceful gradual reform possible, though bourgeoisie may resort to force when facing defeat. Then workers may retaliate. Marx's views were ambiguous. He moved from radical to more moderate positions. Radicalism fits capital. Antagonism must increase, no compromise. Capitalism only destroyed, not improved. The famous passage on historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, misery, oppression, rebellious indignation, disciplined unity, monopoly becoming fetter. The expropriators are expropriated, supports violent overthrow. If we grant first step premise and first conclusion of second step, prophecy of social revolution follows for a united class conscious proletariat unable to mitigate misery otherwise. But first conclusion is invalid. From premise alone we get rebellious outbreaks, not identifiable social revolution, nor necessarily victory. Moderate theories destroy the prophetic argument. Compromise and gradual reform imply decreasing antagonism, undermining the sole basis of prophecy. Workers who learn reform works may prefer compromise rather than risk all for complete victory. Only if the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and increasing misery makes improvement impossible, can overthrow be prophesied. Evolutionary social revolution leaves only historicism. Any new prophecy needs new argument, perhaps workers as majority winning battle of democracy. But abandoning increasing misery removes justification for immense majority. Middle classes may persist and ally against worker power. Statistics no longer show industrial workers growing relative to others, refuting the modified argument. What remains is the important non-prophetic observation that reforms are largely achieved under pressure of class struggle. The emancipation of the oppressed, largely their own achievement. Ambiguity, Engels and the rules of democracy. The prophetic argument is untenable in all interpretations. Full understanding requires examining ambiguity toward violence and conquest of political power, harmless democratic aim of majority government, or entrenchment making recovery by opponents difficult. Planning suppression implies accepting the present majority's right to do the same. Both ambiguities root in Marxist state theory. If the state is class tyranny, violence is permissible and only proletarian replaces bourgeois dictatorship. Formal democracy lacks historical sense. Democracy is only one of the stages in the course of the historical development, Lenin. Tactical use of ambiguity recruits followers, but may split when radicals think the hour has struck. Communist International 1928 program is unambiguous on violent conquest. Yet parties withdraw to nonviolent interpretation when tactically needed. Engels' moderate doctrine prefer peaceful democratic development, as realists expect bourgeoisie to destroy democracy when workers near majority. Workers must not flinch, prepare for fight. Take the first shot, gentlemen of the bourgeoisie. Tactically absurd, inviting the stronger side to choose the moment and prepare overwhelming force. The doctrine inverts Marxism, revolution from pressure of successful worker movement, not increasing capitalist pressure on workers. Deeper criticism. Engels' doctrine and ambiguities make democracy unworkable once adopted by an important party. Democracy works only if main parties adhere to rules such as these. Democracy is not merely majority rule. Powers of rulers must be limited. The criterion is whether rulers can be dismissed without bloodshed. We distinguish democracies with such institutions from tyrannies. A democratic constitution should exclude only changes endangering its democratic character. Full protection of minorities does not extend to those inciting violent overthrow. Institutions must assume anti-democratic tendencies among ruled and rulers. If democracy is destroyed, all rights are destroyed. Democracy is the battleground for reasonable reform. Preserving it must be first in any particular battle. Marxist policy of making workers suspicious of democracy. Engels, in reality, the state is nothing more than a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and this holds for a democratic republic no less than for a monarchy. Produces blaming democracy for evils Democrats and opposition share, educating rule to see state as rulers not theirs, and neglecting checks on power. Against the manifesto's first step to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, I assert, if accepted as first step, the battle of democracy will be lost. Engels' tactics and ambiguities are last consequences of Plato's "Who should rule?" We must ask, how can we tame them? And how much power is wielded? All political problems are institutional. Historical illustration. Fascism and the communist response. Parties have vested interest in opponents' unpopular moves. Marxist parties sometimes welcomed anti-democratic moves as exposing real democracy. Policy of letting opponents expose themselves becomes disaster when extended to moves against democracy. Talking war. Acting peace taught fascists to talk peace, act war. Revolutionary or political strike as offensive weapon strengthens anti-democratic tendencies. As defensive demand for democracy, it may succeed, cap push. Use the whip when the dog is good, and it won't deter bad behavior. Workers' anti-democratic action gives enemies opportunity to portray democracy unworkable. After defeat, some Marxists concluded they were too lenient. Next time, a bloodier revolution, like losing a boxing match and choosing a club. Marxists taught class war in theory. Reactionary diehards learned practice. Marx talked war. Opponents talked peace and accused workers of belligerency. Fascists acted. Communists had a program. Copy Russia. Democracy merely bourgeois dictatorship. Open dictatorship might bring revolution nearer. Fascism could speed matters. Revolution overdue after Russia despite backward conditions. Democracy held back advanced countries. Fascism was bourgeoisie's last stand. Communists did not fight fascist seizure of power. Harmless, no communist danger. Only part of the church seriously resisted. Einstein. Quote, along with the steady decrease in the number of capitalist magnates, there grows the extent of misery, oppression, servitude, degradation, and exploitation. But at the same time, there rises the rebellious indignation of the working class. Ultimately, the monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production. The expropriators are expropriated. Chapter 20, Capitalism and its Fate. Marxist doctrine holds that capitalism labors under inner contradictions, threatening its downfall. The minute analysis of those contradictions and of the movement they impose on society is the first step of Marx's prophetic argument, the step on which he spent most of Capital, the least abstract because it describes unrestrained capitalism with statistics. Lenin states the point. Marx deduced the inevitability of socialism wholly from the economic law of the movement of contemporary society. Before examining that step in detail, I shall sketch its main ideas. Marx believes competition forces capitalists to accumulate even against their long-term profit interest. Unwittingly, they serve historical progress and socialism. Accumulation means rising productivity and concentration of wealth alongside pauperism kept its subsistence by the Industrial Reserve Army. The trade cycle prevents lasting absorption of surplus workers. Capitalist accumulation becomes suicidal, fostering technical progress towards socialism while deepening misery. Premises: competition, accumulation, misery. Under capitalism, competition is fought by underselling. Cheapness depends on productivity, which large-scale production and machinery increase. Big capitalists beat small ones. Credit accelerates centralization. Competition, accumulation, and rising productivity are fundamental tendencies. Concentration and centralization belong to the conclusion. Growing wealth in fewer hands. Increasing misery may mean wider spread of misery, greater intensity, or, for prophecy, wider spread without marked decrease in intensity. Fundamentally, it means increasing exploitation of employed workers. The unemployed assist by pressuring wages. Unemployment corroborates Marx only if joined by intensified exploitation of those still employed. The decisive doctrine is that capitalism cannot afford to lessen misery. Accumulation keeps capitalists under pressure. They must pass to workers if they are not to perish. Hence, capitalism cannot be reformed, but can only be destroyed. Increasing wealth would be harmless if workers could share it. Marx's denial is the main target of criticism. Accumulation and concentration of wealth can hardly be questioned. Rising productivity is largely sound, though machine investment has limits. 3 lines of argument support increasing misery: value theory, surplus population and wages, trade cycle, falling rate of profit. I turn to them after this first part of the conclusion. Quote, according to Marxist doctrine, capitalism is laboring under inner contradictions that threaten to bring about its downfall. A minute analysis of these contradictions and of the historical movement which they force upon society constitutes the first step of Marx's prophetic argument. Labor theory of value and surplus value. Marx's value theory is, in my opinion, among the less important parts of Marxism, yet I must discuss it because others treat it as foundational. Showing the theory weak strengthens Marxism if decisive political doctrines can stand without it. The labor theory says commodities exchange roughly in proportion to labor hours. Behind fluctuating prices stands value as average necessary labor time. Surplus value answers, how does the capitalist profit if goods sell at value? Only by paying workers less than the value their labor creates. Wages cover necessary labor time. The rest is surplus. A difficulty arises. Labor seems sold below value, violating the general law. Plausible bullying by monopoly of means of production destroys the theory. Marx's stroke. The worker sells labor power, not labor hours. Labor power's value equals subsistence labor time. Longer working day yields surplus to the buyer. High productivity makes exploitation possible even in an ideal market where every commodity, including labor power, trades at value. Injustice lies not in cheating on price, but in poverty forcing sale and riches enabling purchase. Marx saved the labor theory and explained liberal legal forms as formal justice masking exploitation. My criticism has three heads. Value theory does not suffice for exploitation. B. Supplementary assumptions suffice without value. C. The theory is essentialist. The law of value asks why prices gravitate to values. Marx answers via supply and demand under competition, especially excess labor, keeping wages near starvation. But if supply and demand explain starvation wages, value is redundant. They also explain monopolistic deviations Marx treated as exceptions. Exploitation phenomena follow from free labor market plus chronic labor surplus. No need to mention value. What remains after eliminating value is sound if surplus population is granted. Why supply persistently exceeds demand Marx did not adequately explain. Low productivity and imperfect competition may matter more than perfect competition. The notion of objective value behind prices as form of appearance bears Platonic idealism. Marx tried to demystify value as labor hours, but with rising productivity, the terminology misleads. Workers may gain in goods while value of income falls. Platonic essence divorced from experience. Quote, in such a society, the injustice of exploitation does not lie in the fact that the worker is not paid a just price for his labor power, but rather in the fact that he is so poor that he is forced to sell his labor power, while the capitalist is rich enough to buy labor power in great quantities and to make profit out of it. Surplus population, unions, and intervention. Eliminating value theory. We retain analysis of surplus population pressing wages down. With free labor market and chronic unemployment, wages cannot rise above starvation levels. In a world of high profits and increasing wealth, permanent misery for workers is possible. Marx was wrong to prophesy permanence and worsening. Facts refuted him. Even on his analysis, misery operates only under unrestrained capitalism. Trade unions, collective bargaining, and strikes break the assumptions. Labor can monopolize its sale, block use of the reserve army, force lower profits. Workers, unite, was the Marxian reply to unrestrained capitalism, and it opened state intervention. Capitalists contest union freedom as danger to labor market competition. Non-intervention faces the paradox of freedom. Which freedom should the state protect? Any decision extends state economic responsibility and dissolves Marx's premises. The law of increasing misery as historical prophecy fails. What remains is vivid description of 19th century misery explained by the economic law of unrestrained capitalism of that day, not inevitability. Trade cycle and piecemeal policy. Marx's case rests partly on real surplus population. His mechanism, that capitalism produces the reserve army it needs, includes trade cycle theory. I amend it slightly by distinguishing machinery for extension from machinery for intensification, setting workers at liberty. Expansion absorbs reserve army. Wages rise. Labor-saving machines become profitable. When they enter production, unemployment and market collapse follow. Financial crisis ensues. Recovery ripens as reserve army grows, and starvation wages restore profit. Cycle repeats. I do not criticize the theory here. Trade cycles are difficult and underexplored. Credit and hoarding may be underplayed. Marx's merit is treating the cycle as a social problem. We may criticize the prophecy built on it. Worsening depressions unsupported. Workers' suffering was worse in Marx's day than under modern unemployment insurance. Countercycle policy and intervention were foreign to unrestrained capitalism Marx analyzed. Claiming he proved piecemeal measures impossible is as dogmatic as proofs that aviation must remain impossible. Opposing experiments that might relieve suffering is irresponsible. Marxist movements acquire vested interests, including intellectual investments. Marx held unemployment keeps exploitation of the employed central. Later experience refutes that prophecy. Real wages of employed workers rose. During depressions, they often rose relative to prices. Unemployment insurance burden fell on entrepreneurs, not workers as Marx's scheme required. Falling rate of profit. None of the theories yet proves capitalists must pass economic pressure to workers on pain of destruction. The falling rate of profit attempts that proof. Rate of profit is profit over total invested capital. Marx says it tends to fall because capital must accumulate faster than profits rise. Competition forces productivity-raising investment. Capital divides into immobilized and wage capital. Only wage capital yields exploitation profit. Productivity growth swells immobilized share. Total capital grows faster than profit. Rate falls. The argument may have something in it, especially with cycle theory, but linked to increasing misery is weak. Marx says falling rate forces capitalists to intensify exploitation. In longer hours, speed up, wage cuts, inflation, women and children. Yet increased productivity is the basis of exploitation. Profits need not dwindle, only the rate. Income and savings may rise comfortably without desperate measures. Speculators on constant profit rates may suffer. That accentuates depression, but not Marx's sweeping climax. Experience, auxiliary hypotheses, and party tactics. To show how wrong Marx was in prophecy and how right in protesting unrestrained capitalism, I quote Capital on accumulation. Factories using up young men. Average age at death 17 for laborers versus 38 for middle class in Manchester. Rising productivity worsening conditions. Methods of raising productivity becoming domination and mutilation. The facts of his day were largely as he said. Prophecy failed. Auxiliary hypothesis. Misery of metropolitan workers offset by colonial exploitation. Lenin's bourgeoisification. But Scandinavian democracies, Canada, Australia achieve high standards without colonies. Holland and Belgium versus Denmark and Norway show no advantage to colonial powers for workers. Native misery has not steadily increased since Marx. Social democrats dropped intensity of misery, but kept extent. Industrial proletariat must grow to majority. They waited for class consciousness to win elections, while statistics showed no such majority trend. A democratic workers' party justified only if ready to compromise with peasants and middle classes. Asserting proletarian policy will lead to rural producers via town workers is no substitute. Communists kept full increasing misery theory. Tactics demanded fighting for workers' bread, while teaching petty fights cannot succeed. Only revolution helps. When fights succeeded, demands escalated. Misery decreased. Workers bargained instead of plotting. Policy reversed. Stir colonial unrest. Foment catastrophes to restore misery. Workers grew suspicious. Principle the worse, the better destroys trust. Policy reversed again. Fight for improvement while hoping for opposite. Inner contradictions. Treachery and faithfulness interchange. Intellectuals leave or sacrifice integrity and become mystics. Not only capitalism labors under contradictions threatening downfall. Quote, "It seems that it is not only capitalism which is laboring under inner contradictions that threaten to bring about its downfall." Chapter 21. An evaluation of the prophecy. Marx's prophetic argument fails, and it fails for a reason that has little to do with the poverty of his empirical observation. His sociological and economic descriptions of 19th century capitalism may be one-sided, yet, as descriptions they remain formidable. The failure lies in historicism itself. Even if we observe what looks like a trend today, we cannot know that tomorrow will wear the same face. Prophecy dressed in the language of economic law remains prophecy. What survived and what did not? It seems to me that Marx was right in two large practical respects. He saw that the unrestrained capitalism he knew could not last forever, and that those who treated it as eternal were deceiving themselves. He saw, too, that association among workers, the class struggle in the institutional sense, would help transform the system. But it does not follow that he foresaw interventionism under the name of socialism. What he called socialism aimed at diminishing state power, Interventionism has increased it almost everywhere. I criticize Marx while sympathizing with his hope that political power might shrink. That hope is also the greatest danger of intervention, especially direct intervention, since bureaucracy grows while reformers look away. Yet this, again, is a problem for social piecemeal engineering, and it must be faced early if democracy is to survive. We must plan for freedom, not only for security, because only freedom can make security secure. One tendency Marx identified does seem more durable than the rest: accumulation of the means of production and rising labor productivity. That tendency may continue as long as civilization continues. Marx also grasped, earlier than most, the destructive connection between rising productivity and the credit system, including the trade cycle. Whether his own cycle theory is true, and how far, I do not know, but the link between productivity gains and cyclical unemployment deserves to be taken seriously. Productivity balance. When labor becomes more productive, at least one compensating development must occur: investment, higher consumption, shorter hours, expanded non-industrial employment, or destructive outcomes such as unemployment, idle capital, armaments, or war. Quote, "The arguments underlying Marx's historical prophecy are invalid. His ingenious attempt to draw prophetic conclusions from observations of contemporary economic tendencies failed. The reason for this failure does not lie in any insufficiency of the empirical basis of the argument. Institutional success versus historicist failure. Marx's paraphrased trade cycle mechanism, that approaches to full employment stimulate labor-saving machinery, which later deepens depression, may contribute something to explanation, but it is not itself a theory of why the market fails to equilibrate. Marx's real achievement is to have treated the cycle as a social problem at all. And some of his prophecies have, for a time, come true. Productivity rises, cycles continue. Intervention restricts the free market. Worker organization matters. Does that rehabilitate historicism? A closer look shows that wherever Marx succeeded, he succeeded by institutional analysis, not by laws of historical development. Competition forcing accumulation is institutional. Surplus population and the cycle are institutional. Class struggle is institutional. His sweeping, inexorable laws and stages that cannot be leaped have not stood up. The ambitious prophecies are intellectually thin, wishful, politically unimaginative, tied to a naive belief in progress shared with Hegel, Kant, and Mill. Fisher's remark is decisive. Progress is written large on history, but it is not a law of nature. Ground gain may be lost. Everything remains possible in politics. Marx's prophecies might even have come true had progressive optimism become a political force strong enough to realize them. A correct prediction need not corroborate a scientific theory. It may testify to religious faith. Marx's prophecy gave suffering workers a mission when they most needed one. Without his discouragement of social technology, European affairs might have moved toward a non-collectivist socialism built on planning for freedom. That would not have verified prophecy. It would have shown what humanitarian faith combined with critical reason can do. Instead, the prophetic element devoured the rest, banishing cool judgment and the belief that reason can change the world. What remained was Hegelian oracular philosophy in Marxist dress, paralyzing the struggle for the open society. Quote, "In view of this list of important and largely successful prophecies, is it justifiable to speak of the poverty of historicism? But a closer view of Marx's successes shows that it was nowhere his historicist method which led him to success, but always the methods of institutional analysis." Chapter 22. The Moral Theory of Historicism. Capital was meant to discover inexorable laws of social development, not to equip the social technologist. Marx condemned utopian blueprints and moral sermons. Yet his work carries an ethical theory in spite of itself, expressed mainly through moral evaluations of institutions. Capitalism is condemned not for wealth as such, but for oligarchical power, for turning labor power into a commodity, for a system that resembles slavery while wearing the mask of formal justice. By stressing our responsibility for remote social repercussions of what we tolerate, Marx made institutions, not merely individual virtue, the field of ethics, the implicit ethic of capital. Marx hated preaching and distrusted moralists who drank wine while preaching water. Humanity and decency needed no argument for him. He attacked apologists of the existing order and eulogists of formal liberty within a system that destroyed freedom. By implication, he loved freedom. Despite holist leanings, he was no collectivist, for he hoped the state would wither away. His faith, I believe, was fundamentally a faith in the open society. His attitude toward Christianity parallels Kierkegaard's exposure of official morality. Townsend's well-wisher theology, which makes hunger permanent among workers so the delicate may pursue higher callings, is the kind of hypocrisy Marx dissected. Christianity owes something to Marx, as it owed something to Luther, a challenge answered by Counter-Reformation and revised standards. Early Marxism, with its ethical rigor and insistence on deeds, was perhaps the most important corrective idea of our time. Activism, the last thesis on Feuerbach, changed the world, do not merely interpret it, expresses socialism as kingdom of freedom, where irrational forces no longer rule and reason can control human affairs. Yet historicism countered activism. Under capitalism, Marx held, we must submit to inexorable laws and only shorten and lessen the birth pangs. The gulf between making our fate and prophesying it widened when he denounced as utopian any rational planning for a better world. I believe that view cannot be defended and leads to mysticism. Still, Marx and Engels sketched a bridge I call historicist moral theory. Quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Historicist morality and moral futurism. Unwilling to treat humanitarian aims as ultimate, Marx and Engels derive them from social circumstances. Moral categories depend on historical situation. Justice always means justice in a class sense. Engels listed Christian feudal, bourgeois, and proletarian moralities as coexisting products of development. But historicist morality goes further. Pressed to say why he fought exploitation, Marx might have answered, as a scientist, I see that moral ideas are weapons in class struggle. As a scientist, I cannot remain aloof. Every attitude takes sides. Having chosen the proletariat, I adopt its morality. Before that fundamental decision, I have no morality at all. Only a scientific forecast that bourgeois morality must disappear and proletarian morality win. Resistance would be as mad as resisting gravity. Thus, the reasonable world comes without being planned by reason. Activism is reduced to shortening birth pangs. This theory rests on correct historical prophecy. Even granting foreknowledge for 500 years, the imperative adopt the moral system of the future is not binding. A humanitarian watching France from 1764 to 1864 might reject Napoleon III's standards and teach his own and hope they survive. One who foresees slavery might still refuse the morality of the cage. The fundamental decision cannot be derived from knowledge of the future. Whether we should accept future morality because it is future is itself a moral question. Historicist morality is moral futurism, moral positivism with the future substituted for the present. Commonmind is right. The conservative who sides with present power and the futurist who sides with tomorrow's power can call each other cowards interchangeably. Marx, I think, would have repudiated this if he had seen it. His socialism sprang from love of the oppressed, not from siding with winners. He preached freedom in action, not words, because words like freedom had been twisted. Historicist formulations veiled moral beliefs he was reluctant to state. Moral futurism survives today in the worship of success and the slogan that history will be our judge, forgetting that the present was once the future. Sociologism in ethics. Dropping fictitious prophecy destroys historicist moral theory. We cannot shift moral responsibility onto the future. Marx's historicist ethics flows from sociological determinism. Opinions, including moral standards, depend on society and class. Education passes on culture and standards. Science depends on social stratum. Such theories chatter trivialities in oracular jargon. That man is shaped by society is true. So is the converse, that society is shaped by men and their aims. Which aspect matters more? The practical question for us is whether the next generation will reflect our actions and upbringing. Our minds are not wholly determined by upbringing because we can criticize experience. The same holds for society as environment. Thought depends on social intercourse and language, yet we can criticize thoughts and change institutions. Beethoven illustrates the limit of sociological reduction. He is product of musical tradition and also producer of it. Sociological explanations of his orchestras say very little. Marx's own case refutes sociological determinism. Historicism fits conservative apology better than revolutionary reform, yet Marx let it oust activism. Accident, predecessor worship, short-sightedness, not class interest alone. His moral criticism of capitalism as unjust system, not merely unjust individuals, was the secret of his influence. That moral radicalism is still alive. Our task is to keep it alive while political historicism goes the way it must go. Scientific Marxism is dead. Social responsibility and love of freedom need not die with it. Quote, "It is this moral radicalism of Marx which explains his influence, and that is a hopeful fact in itself. This moral radicalism is still alive. It is our task to keep it alive, to prevent it from going the way which his political radicalism will have to go." Chapter 23, The Sociology of Knowledge. Hegel's and Marx's historicism belongs to an age of terrifying social change. Plato tried to arrest change. Modern historicists accept it, yet still seek to tame it by prediction and, increasingly, by a centralized planning. A compromise between Platonic arrest and Marxian inevitability that demands the state control what cannot be stopped. That posture looks rationalist. In fact, it allies with doctrines hostile to the rational unity of mankind. I mean sociologism, the view that our opinions, moral and scientific, are determined by class interest and social habitat, developed by Schiller and Mannheim as a theory of the social determination of knowledge. Total ideologies and the Hegelian cure. The sociology of knowledge holds that thought proceeds not in a vacuum, but in a social habitat so familiar it seems self-evident, like all tables are tables. Different habitats yield different total ideologies between which no intellectual bridge exists. The theory continues Kant's activist critique of the bucket theory of mind. We do not receive knowledge as gifts stored in a museum. We search, compare, generalize. Kant gave up presuppositionless science and posited a categorical apparatus. Hegel made it historical and national. Marx divided it by class within a nation. Radical skepticism between ideologies is not final. A loosely anchored intelligentsia, like Hegel poised above prior philosophies, may unveil hidden motives, sociotherapy replacing psychotherapy, achieving objectivity by analyzing ideologies anchored in the unconscious. This belongs with psychoanalysis and philosophies that unveil the meaninglessness of opponents' tenets. The pleasure of seeing through fools is harmless only if it does not destroy discussion by reinforced dogmatism. Hegelianism does it by declaring prior philosophies mere stages aufgehoben in a higher synthesis, psychoanalysis by repression, sociologism by total ideology. The method is self-defeating. If thought is class-determined, why trust the sociologist's thought? Scientific objectivity as public criticism. Scientific objectivity is not individual impartiality, but the product of public method. Robinson Crusoe might master survival, but would invent neither language nor argument. We owe reason to intercourse with others, as the Crusoe who discovered reaction time by private reflection differs from science, which learns through contradictions between observers. Kantians and Hegelians exaggerate when they treat presuppositions as beyond test. Einstein questioned space and time themselves. Science eliminates prejudices one by one. We discover a prejudice only after shedding it. Truth is not relative because results are provisional. If an assertion is true, it is true forever. Social sciences lack full publicity of method, partly through Aristotle and Hegel, partly through failure to use institutions of objectivity. So, some social scientists cannot speak a common language. The cure is not dialectical synthesis or self-analysis, but trial and error, hypotheses tested by piecemeal social engineering. Sociologism blames the entanglement of knowledge and will in politics, but will enters all inquiry, and practice is the best corrective to scholasticism. Making scientists aware of unconscious determinants does not remove prejudice. Those most convinced they are free of it are often most prejudiced. Freedom is the appreciation of necessity, is reactionary. Knowledge of political tyranny does not make one free. Self-analysis is no substitute for democratic institutions that protect critical thought. Quote, rationality, in the sense of an appeal to a universal and impersonal standard of truth, is of supreme importance, not only in ages in which it easily prevails, but also, and even more, in those less fortunate times in which it is despised and rejected as the vain dream of men who lack the virility to kill where they cannot agree. Piecemeal engineering versus sociotherapy. The sociology of knowledge preserves Hegel's prejudice while claiming to overcome prejudice. Only practical action, institutions guaranteeing freedom of criticism, can secure the progress science embodies. Social technology tested by piecemeal engineering is diametrically opposed to sociologism's program of consciousness raising. Where Marxist vulgarism unveiled hidden motives, sociologism generalizes the method. But the main trouble with prejudice is that there is no direct way to know we have overcome it. The open society needs not socioanalysis of opponents, but the same methods that work in the natural sciences, applied with honesty to the practical problems of our time. I believe that once we see objectivity as an institutional achievement rather than a private virtue, the sociology of knowledge loses its claim to be the higher therapy of the age. Quote, what we call scientific objectivity is not a product of the individual scientist's impartiality, but a product of the social or public character of scientific method, and the individual scientist's impartiality is, so far as it exists, not the source but rather the result of this socially or institutionally organized objectivity of science. Chapter 24. Oracular Philosophy and the Revolt Against Reason. Marx was a rationalist with Socrates and Kant in believing human reason grounds mankind's unity. Yet class determination of opinion, like Hegel's national determination, undermined that belief. Threatened from right and left, rationalist social thought could hardly resist historicist prophecy and oracular irrationalism. The conflict between rationalism and irrationalism is, I believe, the most important intellectual and perhaps moral issue of our time. Rationalism defined. I use reason and rationalism widely to include observation and experiment, not reason opposed to empiricism. Rationalism seeks to solve problems by clear thought and experience rather than by appeal to emotions and passions. More precisely, readiness to listen to critical arguments and learn from experience. Admitting, I may be wrong and you may be right, and by an effort we may get nearer to the truth. Hope that argument and careful observation may yield agreement and equitable compromise. The attitude of reasonableness resembles science. Cooperation in search of truth, something like objectivity. Reason, like language, is a social product. Crusoe might be clever, but would not invent argument. We argue with ourselves only because we learn to argue with others and that the argument counts, not the person. We owe reason to intercourse. Considering the person, not the argument, establishes the rational unity of mankind. Every communicator a potential source of reasonable information. Hegelians say we owe reason to society and infer the collective is everything. We owe it to concrete individuals and intellectual intercourse, and interpersonal, not collectivist theory. Tradition matters, but must be analyzed into personal relations. We may judge traditions by their influence on individuals. Reason is not a faculty possessed in vastly different degrees. Clever men may be unreasonable. We cannot excel others in reasonableness so as to claim authority. Authoritarianism and rationalism cannot be reconciled. Planning the growth of reason from above is a Platonic dream. Reason grows by mutual criticism through institutions safeguarding freedom of thought. True rationalism, Socratic awareness of limitation, intellectual modesty, knowing we err and depend on others. Pseudo-rationalism, Platonic intellectual intuitionism, claim to certainty and authority, opinion shared by all, reason by gods and few. Irrationalism insists human nature is mainly non-rational. The majority must be moved by emotion. Even scientists love rationalism emotionally. Intuition makes great scientists. Rationalism fails conspicuously outside science, and science is the favorable case. Quote, rationalism is an attitude of readiness to listen to critical arguments and to learn from experience. It is fundamentally an attitude of admitting that I may be wrong and you may be right, and by an effort, we may get nearer to the truth. 2. The long conflict. Greek philosophy began rationally, yet carried mystical yearning for lost tribal unity. Open conflict first in Middle Ages. Scholasticism versus mysticism. Later rationalism rose. Burke and others criticized pseudo-rational immodesty with gratitude due true rationalists. Now the tide turned. Oracular irrationalism. Bergson, much German philosophy, ignores or deplores the rationalist scientist as poor in spirit, mechanical, blind to destiny. Rationalists dismiss irrationalism as nonsense. Diplomatic breaks among philosophers preceded breaks among states. I side with rationalism. Even excess here is harmless compared with excess the other way, except when rationalism undermines itself and feeds irrational reaction. Hence critical versus comprehensive rationalism. Comprehensive rationalism accept nothing undefended by argument or experience, including itself, therefore self-refuting, like the liar paradox. All argument proceeds from assumptions. Demanding none is inconsistent. Rationalism cannot be established by argument. Only those already rationalists are moved by argument. Adoption is tentative or settled, irrational, faith in reason. Irrationalism can refuse argument without inconsistency. Uncritical rationalism is logically inferior. Panic capitulation to irrationalism is uncalled for. Critical rationalism admits irrational decision for reason. 3. A moral choice and its consequences. The choice between irrationalism and critical rationalism is moral, in Chapter 5 sense. It affects attitude toward others and social life. Rationalism connects with belief in unity of mankind. Irrationalism may combine with brotherhood, but easily with romantic belief in elect bodies, leaders and led, masters and slaves. Arguments cannot determine the fundamental decision, but analyzing consequences helps. As Shaw's chaplain learning what burning means, imagination distinguishes blind from open-eyed choice. Oracular philosophy maddens with words. Irrational emphasis on emotion leads, I am convinced, to crime. Resignation before irrational human nature becomes scorn for reason and appeal to violence when constructive passions fail. Stress on inequality of gifts slides into political anti-equalitarianism. Equality before the law is moral decision, not description of birth equality. Irrationalism entangles with friend and foe, tribe, believer and unbeliever, class comrade and enemy, leader and led. Abandoning respect for the other fellow's argument produces we think with our blood, or grace-taught reason of the few. Judging the thinker, not the thought, political equalitarianism becomes impossible. Anti-equalitarian politics in the field of power is what I call criminal, justifying different rights, slavery, murder, as in Plato. He who teaches love, not reason, opens the way for rule by hate. Love alone cannot settle conflicts. Tom and Dick at Theater versus Dance. No emotion replaces institutions controlled by reason. Making people happy is among the most dangerous political ideals. Imposing our scale of values, utopianism, intolerance, inquisition. Duty is to help those who need help. Right to foster happiness is privilege among friends who can end friendship. Public morals, fight suffering, leave higher, values largely non-agenda. Help enemies, assist the distressed, love only friends. Critical rationalism, faith in others' reason, reject authority, listen and respond. Duty toward institutions protecting criticism, piecemeal social engineering, planning for freedom. Common language kept clear, not romantic self-expression but communication. Translatable reason unites mankind. Kant grounded the golden rule on reason. We do not kill when we first listen. Ethics has no rational scientific basis in the manner of physics. Yet there is an ethical basis of science. Tolerance at least toward those not intolerant themselves. Rationalism links to responsibility for repercussions of our actions on others, to moral obligation to support institutions of free criticism, to demand that society be made more rational by piecemeal means, not by platonic pseudo-rational authority coercing even happiness. The romantic jargon of educationists treats language as self-expression, combined with Hegelian collectivism about reason and individualism about emotion. It belongs to the revolt against reason, against irrational division into elect and lost. Rationalism maintains that mother tongues, insofar as they are rational, translate into one another, establishing the unity of human reason as a practical and moral fact, not a mystical revelation. Quote, "It is my firm conviction that this irrational emphasis upon emotion and passion leads ultimately to what I can only describe as crime." Imagination and humanitarianism. Imagination is not essentially irrational. Institutionally, rationalism needs it for criticism, invention, and practicing equalitarian partiality. Understanding distant others' thought cannot love en masse. Experience tends to pair rationalism with humanitarian equalitarianism, irrationalism with anti-equalitarian tendencies, even when humanitarian language is kept. 4. Romantic revolt and practical tests. The decision is moral. Try to treat others and ourselves as rational. Intellectual fashion, admiring medieval mysticism, fails duty to fellow men. Moral forces in modern science are missed. Keller's passage, soul regaining mystical faculties, myth against materialization, is historicist moral futurism and word magic. Does the soul protest against reduced hunger and pestilence? Did the mind suffer as technician more than as serf? Hope lies in machinery, taking mechanical drudgery. Marx was right that productivity humanizes labor. Dreams of leaders are not as reliable as scientific programs. Myth of revolution is romantic hysteria of tribal dissolution. Tribal Christianity refusing the cross of civilization. Return to the cage. Critics withdraw to claim no common language with unmystical souls, like psychoanalysis defeating opposition by repression, sociologism by total ideology, dividing near from far. Racial thinking with blood, and Hegelian grace rhetoric attack, spiritual unity of mankind. Science enforces practical tests, no profits by fruits. McMurray, science restores integrity of theory and practice. Cooperative progress without frontiers is fullest Christianity Europe has seen. Western rationalism and science owe much to Socratic and Christian brotherhood and honesty. Eddington and Jeans err in philosophical mysticism outside their fields. Science grows humble through error, Socratic spirit. Philosophically, irrationalists rationalize the irrational. Mystics repeat that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible. Mystery belongs to unique individuals and relations, not abstract universals. The mystical transfer of personal uniqueness to forms seeks lost tribal unity. Wittgenstein's world as limited whole misplaces the mystical in abstractions. 19th century science versus religion is superseded. Choice is between faiths, reason and individuals versus mystical union with collective. Present fashionable irrationalism is a superficial but dangerous social disease. V. Whitehead and Toynbee. Whitehead, mathematician and Russell's collaborator, calls himself rationalist but owes Hegel much, builds metaphysical systems with royal contempt for argument. His decline from the critical atmosphere of Principia Mathematica is symptomatic. Disillusionment with comprehensive rationalism drives many toward oracular substitutes. That move is unnecessary if one adopts critical rationalism and keeps working where tests exist, in science and piecemeal politics, rather than legislating for the universe in untestable antitheses. In process, in reality, he defends speculative philosophy by analogy with scientific progress. Kant's obvious reply: physics progresses by experiment. Metaphysics does not. Whitehead switches to no brute facts and need for interpretation, different argument. Hegelian method: avoid proofs, decree. Take it or leave it. Final antitheses: God permanent and world fluent, etc., do not even appear self-contradictory. Neo-Hegelianism: bundle of old patches torn from Kant's crazy quilt. Toynbee's study of history is remarkable. I charge irrationalism not to show hostility, but because poison in merit reveals danger. He often refuses serious arguments at face value, socioanalysis before validity. Where arguments are absent that may be fair, where they exist, neglect is irrationalism. On Marx, he shares much of my practical judgment: Jewish apocalyptic historical necessity, inversion of roles, brilliant analogy if analogy only. As analysis, it ignores capital, institutional economics, rational claims. Annex reply: to Marxist, let's imaginary opponent protest genealogy, not scientific socialism. Toynbee admits Christian socialism prior, missing that Marx claimed rational demonstration of socialism's coming. Marx's religious character does not excuse ignoring rational claims. Verdict of history invokes historicist moral futurism. We must decide, history will not. Historism: historical thought relative to time and place. If generalized, paradox of liar, fashion of our habitat. After rational critique, historioanalysis may diagnose historism as reaction to rationalized interventionist age, social science apologetic anti-rationalism, escape to past and prophecy. Toynbee prefers otherworldliness, Muhammad's failure to resist worldly success. Praise for Loyola. I quote only to corroborate diagnosis of escape. Attack on democratic tolerance as low nonviolence versus noble otherworldliness invites retaliation, edifying disillusionment with reason practiced ad nauseum since Hegel. Historioanalysis is not serious criticism. Fundamental criticism differs. I do not oppose religious mysticism, militant anti-rationalism. Faith in reason has equal right to improve human affairs and peace. Toynbee's humanist, building terrestrial Babel, misunderstands. Humanism has proved itself in deeds. Undermining faith in reason hinders brotherhood Christianity might foster. When international crime is the issue, retreat into prophecy and otherworldliness is not humility, but abdication. The rationalist does not promise heaven on earth. He insists that avoidable suffering be attacked by institutions we can criticize and improve. That program is terrestrial because human beings live on earth, not because it worships success, but because it refuses to defer conscience to a future we cannot know. Oracular philosophy, by contrast, offers the comfort of certainty without the discipline of tests. It is therefore politically seductive and morally corrosive in equal measure. My examples: Whitehead's metaphysical decrees, Toynbee's historized evasion of Marx's arguments, are chosen to show the pattern in eminent writers. The pattern is far more widespread in lesser oracular voices that set the tone of an age. Quote, beware of these false prophets. What they are after, without being aware of it, is the lost unity of tribalism. And the return to the closed society which they advocate is the return to the cage and to the beasts. Conclusion. Enough has been said to explain rationalism and irrationalism and why I choose rationalism against the subtle intellectual disease of our time, dangerous in social and political thought despite its superficiality. The choice is not between cleverness and feeling, but between institutions that keep criticism open and oracular habits that close it in the name of destiny, blood, or grace. That is why I treat the revolt against reason as a political as well as a philosophical emergency. Quote, "The conflict between rationalism and irrationalism has become the most important intellectual and perhaps even moral issue of our time." Chapter 25. Has history any meaning? These chapters were never meant as a full history of historicism, only scattered, personal marginal notes. Historicism is a social, political, and moral philosophy. Commenting on its history means discussing society, politics, and morals. Selection of subject matter is personal, yet argument can still be more than opinion where I state proposals explicitly. Selectivity, science, and history. Science is not a mere body of facts. The collector's interest and theory shape selection. Eddington's fear that we chase our own tails because theory shapes what we extract from experience mistakes the logic of testing. We may put much into experience through theory, yet what we get out can overthrow the theory. The searchlight theory of science captures this. What is visible depends on where we aim the light, its color and intensity, and on what is there to be seen. A historical point of view functions similarly as crystallization of interest, a working hypothesis ordering facts. No theory is final. All remain working hypotheses. Relativity of description means only that another point of view would yield another description, not that truth is relative. Historical description shares this selective character with added difficulty. Sources are finite, non-repeatable, often compiled because they fitted someone's prior interpretation. So circularity threatens when we treat interpretation as confirmation. The circularity charge fails. We seek facts that may refute theory, not only confirm it. Falsifiability is the clue to method. Overthrow of theories is progress. Description is selective because the world has infinite aspects and language is finite. Avoiding point of view yields not objectivity, but unconnected heaps. Naive objectivity is self-deception, especially in history with its infinite subject matter. Particular historical statements are simply true or false, however hard to verify. History resembles physics in requiring a point of view, but differs. Physical theories are tested by searching for refuting facts. Historical, general interpretations often cannot be tested when sources were selected by prior interpretation. Untestable interpretations may be circular, like the unjust charge against science. Progress among interpretations is still possible. Some conflict with records, some need implausible auxiliaries, some connect facts others miss. Specific historical hypotheses sometimes approach scientific testability. Complementary interpretations, progress and retrogression, need not conflict. Each generation may reinterpret history from its problems, provided bias is conscious and critical. There is no history of the past as it actually happened in the naive sense. Historicist substitution. Instead of asking what we should choose as urgent problems and how to solve them, historicism asks which way we are going and what part history has destined us to play. Quote, "There can be no history of the past as it actually did happen. There can only be historical interpretations, and none of them final. And every generation has a right to frame its own." Historical science versus general interpretation. Physics seeks universal laws tested by experiment. Applied science seeks prognosis. Historical explanation seeks singular initial conditions plus trivial universal laws and logic of the situation. Historical sciences have no universal historical laws. Generalization belongs to sociology. Students of history rightly insist on particular events, not pseudo-laws of progress. Without unifying theories, history faces infinite subject matter. Trivial sociological and psychological laws and situational logic are assumed silently. Quasi-theories or general interpretations supply points of view, but are often untestable and circular because sources were selected through them. Competing interpretations may fit the same records. Crucial experiments are rare. Still, we may rank interpretations by fit, parsimony, connecting power, and topical fertility. Each generation may frame complementary histories, progress toward freedom and retrogression toward oppression, if consciously critical. Historicism errs by substituting destiny for choice. It directs the searchlight upon ourselves, paralyzing action. Our need is rational. What problems matter now? How they arose? What roads may solve them? The history of power and the idolatry of success. What people call the history of mankind is usually the history of political power. Egypt, Babylon, Rome, and so on. Not art, language, feeding, or disease. There is no history of mankind, only histories of aspects. Elevating power politics to world history offends decent conceptions of humanity, hardly better than a history of embezzlement as humanity's story. Power affects all. Men worship power. Rulers enforce the curriculum. Worship of power is idolatry born of fear. Theistic historicism, God revealing himself in history, is blasphemy from a rationalist and, I argue, from a Christian view. Hegel's history as play, with professors of history as ghostwriters, substitutes success for conscience. We may interpret history from a Christian point of view and acknowledge Christianity's role in humanitarian ideals, yet we remain responsible for freedom as for our lives. Conscience judges us, not worldly success. Moral futurism equates God's will with historical success. Barth rightly calls neo-Protestant revelation in history inadmissible. Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. Pilate indicates date, not divine approval of power. McMurray's dialectical law that the meek must inherit the earth replaces hope with certainty and conscience with prophecy. Bandwagon morality. Christianity, conscience, and McMurray. Reply that Christ's posthumous success vindicates historicist reading mistakes worldly success for divine approval. Early Christians believe conscience judges power, not the reverse. Equating church growth with God's will approaches moral futurism McMurray shares when he makes historical prophecy the essence of Christianity and deduces socialist commonwealth from a law of human nature. Certainty that the meek must win invites bandwagon ethics. Fascism would, on such logic, be temporary instrument of the same law. I do not advocate otherworldliness, refusing practical help. Christianity teaches faith is proved by helping those who need help. One may despise power, glory, and wealth as measures of life, yet work vigorously for chosen ends, not for history's justification, but for the ends themselves. Kierkegaard saw Hegel's historicism as horrid professorial barrel organ necessity. Schopenhauer's rudeness and Kierkegaard's contempt for brilliant spirit of putridity expose what oracular certainty does to honesty. Education, heroism, and anonymous sacrifice. Our education corrupts admiration of brilliance over substance and romantic staging of history, where we are actors for the gallery. Ethics of fame from Heraclitean hero worship and tribal morality persist. Exaggerated self and collective replace relations to other individuals, dominate or submit, hero or mass. Politicians should fight evils, not impose positive higher values. Teachers may stimulate values among friends who can part, but mass schooling cannot imitate Socratic friendship. Do no harm, and equip the young to choose independently. Our modest aims remote from romantic full personality development. Individualism is still confused with egoism, altruism with collectivism, blocking same proportion between one's importance and others. Sacrifice for historical fame suits aristocrats in textbooks, not equalitarian justice. The unknown soldier symbolizes decline of fame morality. We may sacrifice anonymously without heaven on earth or meaning of history. Meaning imposed, not found. History has no meaning in the sense the question is asked. Facts, including historical facts, cannot decide our ends. We introduce purpose. Men are not equal, but we can fight for equal rights. Institutions are irrational, but we can make them more so. History of power has no end. We can give it ends by fighting for the open society, rule of reason, justice, freedom, equality, control of international crime. The meaning of life is likewise for us to decide. Facts and decisions form a fundamental dualism. Historicism tries to escape responsibility by reading destiny in the course of events, superstition, like choosing lottery numbers by horoscope. Hope we need, certainty we do not. Religion should not be lottery ticket or insurance policy. Historicist religion is idolatry. Progress is not a law. Defending democratic institutions is how freedom and progress depends on us. Drop the judge in history's court. Become makers of fate. Learn from mistakes. Perhaps power may one day be controlled. History badly needs justification, but from us, not from a script written in advance. Quote, history has no meaning, I contend. But this contention does not imply that all we can do about it is to look aghast at the history of political power, for we can interpret it with an eye to those problems of power politics whose solution we choose to attempt in our time. Although history has no ends, we can impose these ends of ours upon it. And although history has no meaning, we can give it a meaning. Conclusion. Volume 2 traces historicism from Aristotle's essentialist seeds through Hegel's new tribalism to Marx's sociological determinism, and then to the oracular irrationalism and moral futurism that historicism breeds when prophecy fails. Aristotle systematized Plato's essentialism and opened the door to knowing essences only through history. Hegel made essences self-moving spirits, turned Kant's critique of metaphysics into a license for contradiction, and identified might with reason in the philosophy of history. Marx inherited that historicism, yet broke with psychologism. Social existence determines consciousness. Sociology enjoys partial autonomy, and economic institutions illuminate legal and political superstructures. Where Marx succeeded, as in class analysis, the paradox of freedom, and institutional description of unrestrained capitalism, he succeeded by situational logic, not by inexorable laws. The prophetic core of Marxism fails. Increasing misery, proletarian unity, inevitable social revolution, and classless socialism do not follow from Marx's premises. Experience refuted the prophecies while vindicating much of the institutional critique. Historicist morality, moral futurism, the worship of tomorrow's might, paralyses activism by substituting destiny for choice. Mannheim's sociology of knowledge generalizes the same prejudice, total ideologies, sociotherapy, and the claim that thought is class-determined undermine the public criticism on which scientific objectivity rests. Against comprehensive rationalism's self-refutation and oracular philosophy's contempt for argument, Popper defends critical rationalism, an irrational decision for reason, institutions safeguarding criticism, and piecemeal social engineering tested by experience. The revolt against reason, Bergson, romantic tribalism, Whitehead's untestable antitheses, Toynbee's historioanalysis and verdict of history, is not a harmless aesthetic fashion, but a political emergency. It divides mankind into elect and lost, blood and grace, near and far. It invites violence when constructive passions fail. Whitehead and Toynbee show how eminent minds retreat from testable inquiry into prophecy. The pattern is the return to the closed society's cage. The closing question, has history any meaning, receives a sober answer. History has no meaning in the historicist sense. No script, no court of justice, no moral futurism that equates success with right. Facts cannot decide our ends. We introduce purpose. The searchlight theory applies. Historical interpretation is selective, provisional, and corrigible, yet particular statements remain true or false. We may impose ends, freedom, justice, democratic control of power, upon a history of power politics that has none of its own. Hope we need, certainty we do not. Volume 2's lesson is that the open society depends on refusing prophecy, keeping criticism public, and making our fate rather than reading it in the course of events. Key persons discussed: Aristotle, Plato's systematizer, essentialism, teleology, and historicist seeds in the doctrine that essences unfold only through history. Popper treats him as conduit, not originator, of modern historicism, valuable chiefly for showing how definition worship breeds oracular philosophy. G.W.F. Hegel, father of modern historicism and new tribalism. Dialectics as immunization against criticism. Philosophy of history as apology for Prussia. Collectivist state spirit. War as court of justice. Popper's verdict. Charlatanry with state patronage, still poisoning moral and social thought. Karl Marx, humanitarian rationalist turned false prophet. Anti-psychologism and institutional sociology are lasting merits. Economic historicism, political impotence, and prophecy of socialism are fatal errors. Popper sympathizes with moral radicalism while rejecting historicist method root and branch. Friedrich Engels, co-architect of historicist moral theory and ambiguous doctrine on violence and democracy. Take the first shot, tactics, and state as machine formally undermine democratic institutions Marxists claim to seek. Immanuel Kant, foil throughout, attack on metaphysics inverted by Hegel. Categories and presuppositions not beyond test. Einstein. Golden rule grounded in listening before acting. Kantian limits on knowledge support critical, not comprehensive, rationalism. Karl Mannheim, developer of sociology of knowledge, total ideologies, intelligentsia as sociotherapist, social determination of thought. Popper rejects sociologism. Objectivity is institutional achievement of public criticism, not unveiling of hidden motives. Alfred North Whitehead, symptomatic decline from Principia Mathematica to neo-Hegelian oracular metaphysics in process and reality. Speculative philosophy without experimental test. Arnold J. Toynbee, eminent historian whose study of history practices historioanalysis, moral futurism, and evasion of Marx's rational claims. Poison and Merit reveals danger of oracular history. Karl R. Popper, critical rationalist analyst, defends piecemeal engineering, democratic control of economic power, and history without meaning, ends imposed by us, not found in events. Key works discussed. Capital, Marx's institutional anatomy of unrestrained capitalism, surplus population, exploitation under formal equality, trade cycle. Not a reliable engine of historical prophecy. Labor theory of value inessential to the moral indictment. Philosophy of history / philosophy of right. Hegel historicist metaphysics of spirit, dialectical progress, state as ethical idea, history as world's court of justice, foundation of right and left totalitarian historicism. Ideology and utopia / sociology of knowledge tradition. Mannheim's social habitat determines total ideologies. Intelligentsia achieves objectivity by analyzing class-bound thought. Hegelian cure preserving prejudice. A study of history. Toynbee remarkable erudition combined with historism, otherworldliness, and verdict of history. Socioanalysis before validity. Escape from rational critique of Marx. Process and reality. Whitehead speculative philosophy defended by analogy with science. No brute facts. Antithetical decrees without test. Neo-Hegelian oracular substitute for critical rationalism. Index of core concepts. Oracular philosophy. The intellectual disease bred when Aristotelian essentialism combines with historicism. Verbal scholasticism. Definitions as sources of knowledge. Contempt for argument. Take it or leave it decrees. Wittgenstein's meaning clarification, Whitehead's antitheses, and Toynbee's historioanalysis are modern variants. Politically seductive because they offer certainty without tests. New tribalism. Hegel's revival of collectivist unity. Nation as spirit. War as historical necessity. Might as right. Transmuted by racialists in a blood and by Marxists in a class war. The unconscious longing is for lost closed society harmony. The return to the cage is the practical danger. Economic historicism. Marx's method of predicting social epochs from analysis of forces of production and class relations. Not vulgar greed psychology, but unintended repercussions within institutional kingdom of necessity. Valuable as suggestion to examine economic background. Fatal when fundamental becomes metaphysical essence and prophecy replaces social technology. Autonomy of sociology/anti-psychologism. Marx's epigram that social existence determines consciousness blocks reduction of institutions to human nature and psychologistic origin stories. Sociology studies unintended repercussions and situational logic. Psychology is one social science among others, not their foundation. Situational logic, explanation of action through the logic of the situation, markets, class positions, power relations, rather than prior assumptions about motives. Rational behavior means conformity to situational constraints. Institutions have structures that enable and constrain persons without reifying collectives. Paradox of freedom. Unlimited economic freedom lets the strong bully the weak. The starving freely accept servitude. Remedy is political. Institutions protecting the economically weak, so formal legal equality requires material safeguards. Marx saw formal freedom masking exploitation. Popper insists democratic politics can tame economic power. Political impotence. Marx's doctrine that law and state are superstructure on economy, so politics cannot alter fundamental reality, only shorten birth pangs. Popper inverts. Political power is fundamental. Property and economic dominance depend on state protection. Merely formal democracy is the only device controlling rulers. Moral futurism. Historicist morality deriving aught from forecast. Adopt tomorrow's moral system because it will win. Bandwagon ethics, equating historical success with right. History will judge substitutes destiny for conscience. Barth's critique of revelation in history and Toynbee's verdict of history exemplify the idolatry. Sociology of knowledge. Mannheim's thesis that thought is class and habitat bound. Between total ideologies, only sociotherapy bridges. Self-defeating if sociologists' thought is equally determined. Preserves Hegel's prejudice while claiming to overcome it. Cure is public method and piecemeal engineering, not consciousness raising. Critical versus comprehensive rationalism. Comprehensive rationalism demands defense of all assumptions, including itself, self-refuting. Critical rationalism admits an irrational decision for reason, then proceeds by argument and test. Panic capitulation to irrationalism is unnecessary. True rationalism is Socratic modesty. Pseudo-rationalism claims intuitive certainty. Class/objective class interest. For Marx, class interest is institutional situation advantageous to a group, not mere psychology. Class struggle explains trends traditional history records. All history is class struggle, is suggestive, not literal. Solidarity may fracture after victory, producing new ruling classes. Surplus value, as Popper reconstructs exploitation explained by chronic labor surplus and poverty forcing sale of labor power under formally just exchange, not necessarily by labor theory of value. Injustice lies in institutional bondage, not cheating on price. Unions and intervention dissolve unrestrained capitalism premises. Searchlight theory. Science and history select by point of view. What we see depends where we aim the light, but refutation remains possible. Relativity of description is not relativity of truth. Historicist substitution of destiny for chosen problems paralyses action. History without meaning. History has no ends or moral script in itself. We impose ends by fighting for open society, rule of reason, justice. Facts and decisions form a dualism historicism tries to collapse. Hope without certainty, progress without law of nature. Piecemeal social engineering, democratic institutional reform tested step by step, opposed to utopian blueprints, historicist prophecy, and sociologistic therapy. Planning for freedom, not holistic replacement of systems. Tame power by institutions, not by asking who shall rule. Revolt against reason. Irrational emphasis on emotion, blood, grace, and destiny. Politically anti-equalitarian, dividing mankind, inviting crime when reason is scorned. Romantic return to tribal unity. Institutions of criticism versus oracular habits, closing debate. Reading comprehension questions. How do Aristotle's essentialism and doctrine of definition prepare the ground for Hegelian historicism and oracular philosophy? What is Hegel's new tribalism? And how do dialectics and the philosophy of history immunize his system against criticism? Distinguish Marx's anti-psychologism and situational logic from vulgar Marxist conspiracy theory and psychologism. What does Marx mean by economic historicism, kingdom of necessity, and ideological superstructure? And how does Popper separate sound economism from sweeping prophecy? Explain the paradox of freedom in the economic realm and Popper's inversion of Marx on political versus economic power. Why does the third step of Marx's prophecy, classless socialism, fail even if workers win? What is the new class problem? Reconstruct Marx's first step argument, accumulation, misery, reserve army, and Popper's reply via unions, intervention, and refuted prophecies. What are Engels' ambiguities on violence and democracy? And why do they make democracy unworkable for Marxist parties? Define moral futurism and historicist morality. Why cannot foreknowledge of the future bind our fundamental moral decision? How does Mannheim's sociology of knowledge parallel Hegelian sociotherapy? And why is scientific objectivity an institutional, not individual achievement? Distinguish critical from comprehensive rationalism. Why is the choice for reason moral rather than logically demonstrable? What is the searchlight theory of history, and how does it differ from historicist claims that history has meaning? Critical probe. Popper credits Marx's institutional analysis while rejecting prophecy. Can one consistently admire Marx's sociology and hold that his political influence was mainly harmful? Where does Popper draw that line? Critical probe. If political power is fundamental, does piecemeal engineering risk strengthening the state in ways that undermine the open society Popper defends? And how does his answer differ from Marx's withering away of the state? Further observations. Aristotle's optimism and teleology. Essences unfolding through change, slumbered 2 millennia before Hegel woke them. The loss is not Aristotle's biography, but the perennial temptation to read destiny into development. Hegel's inversion of Kant turned antinomies from warnings into badges of profundity. The same move lets oracular philosophers avoid refutation while claiming completeness, a pattern Whitehead and Toynbee repeat in gentler voices. Marx's greatest sociological merit, rejecting psychologism, coexists with his greatest error, identifying social science with historical prophecy, the method that freed analysis from Origen's chain practice to fortune-telling. Vulgar Marxism's conspiracy theory is a come-down from capital's institutional unintended consequences. Sociologism is a come-down from Marx's activism into sociotherapy that cannot verify its own freedom from prejudice. The paradox of freedom shows that Marx and Popper share a diagnosis, formal equality insufficient, while diverging on remedy. Marx prophesied impotence of politics. Popper locates democratic control of economic power as the only known safeguard. Marxist parties welcome depression and fascism as confirmations of prophecy, educating opponents in anti-democratic practice. The policy of the worse, the better destroyed trust and left workers without institutions when crisis came. Where Marx succeeded, in cycle theory as social problem, class situation logic, productivity analysis, he succeeded by institutional description. Fisher's remark stands. Progress is not a law of nature, and ground gain may be lost. Moral futurism in secular dress, worship of success, history as judge, parallels Hegelian philosophy of history and Toynbee's otherworldliness. All defer conscience to a future we cannot know and therefore cannot answer to. Critical rationalism's irrational decision for reason is not defeat but honesty. All argument proceeds from assumptions. Institutions must protect criticism because reason grows by mutual correction, not Platonic intuition. History selectivity and untestable general interpretations do not imply relativism. They imply humility, complementary viewpoints, and the duty to frame histories from our problems, not to ask what part destiny assigned us. The Open Society's enemies in Volume 2 share a family resemblance. Prophecy over planning, essence over institutions, tribal unity over individual criticism, whether the tribe is nation, class, race, or spirit. Popper's closing dualism, facts versus decisions, refuses historicist escape from responsibility. Meaning is imposed, ends are chosen, and democratic institutions are how we make those choices without blood.